there are lots of reasons not to cohab. And as I said at the beginning, if you don't want to cohab, don't cohab. It is simpler and easier to keep most reptiles or amphibians singly. However, that doesn't mean that it is impossible to cohab or that there are no benefits to cohabiting.
And people keep rock iguanas together, but then tell all these horror stories about, oh wow, look at this one, how it's taken the leg off this one. And then people just watch it and don't say anything. But I make a video of my leopard geckos together that are just sitting there asleep, and I get bashed.
Chameleons a lot. They would shove a lot of chameleons in together. You'd always have the one that's sat there fine and the other one that's black and sat in the corner, angry at the world.
That research indicates there are some species that we know in the wild are social. Many species of rattlesnakes, garter snakes, we know that they are living communally and they're social.
Welcome back to the Animals at Home Network. My name is Dylan Perrin. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We are back with another roundtable discussion. This is roundtable number 4. I am joined by Francis Koskiri, Lori Tarini, Liam Sinclair, and Joseph Brabin. And I think this is one of the more controversial roundtable discussions that we've done. Today we are discussing cohabiting or cohabiting or cohabitation. It comes under many different names of reptiles and amphibians. Of course, as you know, this is one of those blacklisted things that many people think you should just never do other than mating. And many keepers who do try it often get totally lit up on Facebook and social media and whatnot because people think this is a really bad idea. Now, prior to this, I actually posted a poll on both YouTube as well as Instagram, and I think in total there's probably 150 or 200 votes, and it's sitting about 80% of the people say yes, cohabiting is okay as long as you're doing it properly, and then about 20% say no, you should never cohabit unless it's for mating. So in this podcast, we discuss cohabiting, how you can have success doing it, what are some things you absolutely have to stay away from. We discuss conspecific cohabiting as well as heterospecific cohabiting. And right off the bat, you can see that this is a very long episode. It's full of a ton of information, but really we are just scratching the surface here. As Francis says in the episode at some point, you could essentially write a book on cohabiting. That's how many different factors there are to consider when discussing this topic. So this episode is by no means an instruction manual for how to cohabit reptiles successfully. There could probably be a part 2 and a part 3 of just equally length discussions just to get through all of this. So if you are an advanced keeper who wants to start experimenting with cohabiting, this episode will give you a good framework to start that process with. But don't expect to be able to listen to this episode and then be able to jump into cohabiting right away. This is just going to give you the right set of tools to begin with and maybe a foundation. And then a lot of the work has to be done on the keeper's side. So it's just impossible to cover every possible factor when it comes to cohabiting. But I think we did a really good job. And one last quick thing before we jump into the episode, Lori, Francis, and Joseph have sent me photos of their cohabit setups, and I've just sort of peppered them through the YouTube version of this podcast. And just so you're aware, they're completely randomly placed. They're not correlated with what's actually being discussed at the moment that the picture is displaying on the screen. Now, if you happen to be listening to this on an audio-only platform such as Spotify or Apple, I have made sure there is an album available in the show notes. So head to animalsathome.network.com, click on the round table discussions header, and then click on this episode tile, and there you'll find an album of all the photos that I have in the video that you can just scroll through and flip through. That way you don't have to go back to the YouTube video later and scrub through the video to try to find the photos. You can just go look at them and toggle through them that way. They're wonderful photos, so I do hope you go take a look once you are done listening to the episode. Okay, let's jump into it. Enjoy. Welcome, everybody. This is roundtable number 4, and I think this might be, can we call it one of the more controversial roundtables we've done, just because cohabitation is one of those kind of funny gray areas where some people try it, some people say if you do it, you're dead to the hobby, and they're everything in between. So before we get too far, I'm going to ask Francis, our guest, can you sort of lay out just a broad definition of what we mean by cohabiting? There could be people listening to this for the first time and actually have no idea what we're talking about, and then why it kind of ends up on a blacklist as far as reptile keeping goes.
Sure. So, I mean, what I take cohabiting to mean is having more than one individual of an animal kept in the same enclosure. It can be as simple as that. That's a very broad definition. It doesn't sort of, for example, set in stone the length of time that the animals are kept together, although I suppose for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to take it to mean a permanent cohabitation arrangement. Obviously, if you're breeding animals, by necessity, they'll have to be cohabited for a certain amount of time to get the deed done, so to speak. But I think what is implied here is just keeping them on a more or less permanent basis in the same enclosure. And again, that can come down to two types of cohabitation. You could have conspecific, so the same types of animal kept together, or you can have different types of animals mixed together. So, for example, off the top of my head, say, for example, green anolis and long-tailed lizards. I'm sure they'll come up as specific examples that are often kept together and why this may or may not be a good idea. So it could be, again, males and females of the same species, or it could be the same sex of the same species. It all counts as cohabitation. And I suppose for your second question, why is it viewed negatively by some, not by everybody? Because bad things can happen. And I think it's important to state at the very beginning of this discussion, if cohabitation isn't for you, then don't do it. It's your choice. You don't have to keep animals together. If you feel that it's less risky to keep the animals separate, there's absolutely no problem with that. I think, as we will discuss, there are some reasons to keep animals together. There are some, and even if they're keeper-centric reasons rather than animal-centric, they're reasons, and they're legitimate reasons. That doesn't mean you have to cohabit. But on the other side, I think it's important to keep an open mind and know that there's no hard and fast rule for anything, especially when it comes to living animals. So just because you might choose not to cohabit doesn't mean that it's impossible to cohabit. And there are reasons why these instances of cohabitation have gone wrong that I hope we'll address in this discussion.
Yeah, no, that is perfect. And I think before we go too far, we'll kind of lay out everybody's different, we have sort of a varying expertise or experience as far as cohabiting goes. Starting with myself, I have zero. So that's pretty easy to define. I've never cohabited a species. So maybe we'll go to Liam, and then I'll kind of point at each of you individually. So Liam, what experience do you have as far as cohabiting is concerned?
I worked with species that were cohabbed in a shop setting, but as in terms of my own collection, I have not cohabbed anything.
Although you do have a millipede with some of your snakes,
yeah,
which is kind of like a cohab.
Yeah.
And then Joseph, what about yourself?
Well, I've only been cohabbing I've been cohabbing line day geckos since April 2018. I've been cohabbing me leopard geckos since August. I've been also cohabbing me western green lizards since August. I've got lots of the hatchling line day geckos which have been cohabbing together, in a slightly different story to the parents, as well as like the parent offspring cohabbing is another story as well, which I hope we'll come on to later. And I'm also cohabbing poison dart frogs, and I've also had a go at like a 5-minute 2-week go at cohabbing me Chinese leopard snakes or twin spot rat snakes.
Did you mention the leopard geckos, or did I zone out for a second? Or
yeah, I did mention them.
Yeah, sorry, I was reading my notes as well. Good. And Lori, what about yourself?
My experience with cohabbing is with snakes. If we're talking about reptiles, I have lots of mammals here that are cohabbed, but as far as reptiles, I have cohabbed over the last 3 years 10 different pairs of snakes, and that's been male, female, 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 and one set of 2 males. And this was specifically for behavioral data and observations, which stemmed from when I first got back into snakes almost 4 years ago now. I noticed all of the controversy on social media about cohabbing, and I didn't understand why so many people were going back and forth about that issue. I thought, well, why don't you just look to science and see what science says about the appropriateness of this or not? And as it turned out, I did Google scholar searches and tried to delve into it. And the only actual studies I found were about cohabitation in reference to breeding, and not cohabitation in reference to just general keeping. And so I initially started this project through one of the local community colleges, and then moved it here to our animal sanctuary. And we have interns that come and do internships here. And so what we did is we developed some ethograms. some behavioral catalogs. And as the interns were here, I would have them observe the snakes for certain periods of time, doing just random scan sampling. And we collected data specifically on how much time the animals spent together. And we defined that as in the same habitat, because we would have 2 enclosures that were connected by pass-throughs. And we just notated how much time they spent in the same one. And additionally, we would write down notes as to where they were, like, were they perching together? Were they coiled together? Were they hiding together? So I have notes on those, but specifically the data is just how much time did they spend in the same habitat together versus separate. And then I also kept note of any agonistic behavior because I was very concerned about that. I wanted the animals' welfare to be a priority. So I did not want to put them in a position where if there was any behavior that would be considered maladaptive stress, not the normal stress of species interacting together, but something that was over the top, that we noticed that. So I watched for any agonistic behavior between the snakes. And I have a whole list of what those look like, so we can talk about that later. But that's pretty much it. I did not put any snakes in a situation where there wasn't enough space for 2. In other words, what I would consider adequate space for 1 snake, I doubled that, and all of the resources were doubled or tripled. And the pass-throughs were in such a way that 1 snake couldn't prevent another snake from moving into the other enclosure. So I was not going to deliberately see what would happen if you put them in suboptimal conditions. That's just not the type of research that I want to do. I made sure that they had 2 enclosures connected via pass-throughs, and one always had the opportunity to get away unless they were being blocked inside a hide by the other snake, and that never happened.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's great. And I think, that's one of the areas that we're going to talk about for sure, is dealing with some of the downsides of it. And it is such a contentious area, especially because, like you said, in the Facebook groups, people just blacklist it completely. And it's almost like, education would help that. But at the same time, we don't necessarily want people mixing and playing with this unless they fully understand. So Francis, before we go too far, can you list off, you don't have to go through everything you've ever cohabbed, but maybe just a few of your favorites?
I probably won't, as it's a long list. To be honest, I've always cohabbed some species. It was just the dumb thing when I started. I mean, we're going back 30 odd years, 35 years since I'll approach this as if somebody hasn't watched the last video I did. So I started collecting my own animals in Iberia. That's just what was done as a boy. I used to catch them. And that included frogs, small lizards, geckos, as well as snakes, terrapins. And yeah, as a kid, you just tended to mix them. It didn't always work out, but at other times it did. So over the years, I'll list the good cohabs that I've done. So I cohabitate most rat snakes, for example, a lot of whip snakes. I've cohabited various species of python and boa, lots of tree snakes, loads of lacertid lizards, various species, green lizards, eyed lizards, wall lizards, Samodromus, that sort of thing. Many geckos. I mean, we're talking several dozen different species there. Terrapins and turtles, and then frogs and toads, lots of species as well. Starting from the beginning, I mean, some of the bad experiences I had were very early on. So I remember when I was a kid, I used to go to a place called Roman Oasis near Gibraltar in Spain. And I'd catch viperine snakes, which is a type of water snake, and I'd catch Spanish terrapins, or striped-necked terrapins, as they're called, and I used to put them together. And the baby terrapins used to do really well. It was great. You'd see them in the water. The snakes would swim in the water. They'd climb off into the land area. Everything was hunky-dory until the turtles started getting larger and started nipping at the snakes. And I think that was my first experience where I kind of cottoned on. Maybe these particular animals shouldn't be mixed, because I found like a bite taken out of the side of one of the viperine snakes. Luckily, it wasn't too bad. But at that point, I moved the terrapins out. I think that's a very important point to make as well. If you're going to cohabit, nothing wrong with it. Cohabiting isn't inherently wrong, but you have to always be ready to separate and have space for the extra animals or the problem animals if the things do go wrong. I also used to cohabit a lot of frogs and toads, and again, a lot of these frogs and toads will have different, slight different different requirements in terms of microhabitat, but kept in a large enclosure, they'll find the places they want to be and they can coexist. An example might be American green tree frogs and American grey tree frogs. American grey tree frogs supposedly like it a little drier than green tree frogs, but I cohabited them very well together and very successfully for many years, simply by giving them large enclosures. Again, lizards, there's a lot of agonistic behavior in lizards that you can document, but there's a lot of social behavior as well. People will make out that reptiles are asocial. They're not. There is some element of sociality in most species. What that means, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will always be together or 100% of the time be out basking, but they have ways of signaling one another. With lizards, it's quite obvious. You can see the sort of behavioral, sort of the waving that submissive animals will do to dominant animals, the tail lashing. There's a lot of interesting behaviors that you can watch that can absorb you for hours if you sort of sit there on your sofa just watching them.
Do you have one more that you wanted to list?
Yeah, I mean, there was one particular enclosure with lizards that really hammered it home for me, which was masked curly-tailed lizards. This was in the 90s or so, or the early 2000s, they're a small lizard, about 6 inches long, small iguanid lizard. Now, the males are very beautiful. They're brightly colored. They've got sort of red flanks with little green speckling on them, orange sort of throats, and the females are kind of nondescript and brown. The males, like anoles and bearded dragons, have got very pronounced nodding and head bobbing displays to other males, and they will react very aggressively to one another. Logic would dictate that you can't cohabit more than one male. However, I had 2 males and 3 females in a very large, a 5 foot by 3 foot enclosure, which for a 6-inch lizard, it's not very, very large, but it's larger than a lot of people might give it. And actually, the males both showed interesting behaviors. Both the males bred with females. One of the males took a very dominant role, one a very submissive role, but it actually seemed to work out. And you actually saw some interesting behaviors on the submissive male, where he used to actually sneak in and mate with the females when the dominant male wasn't looking. So although I wouldn't necessarily recommend keeping 2 males of that species together in a large enough enclosure, it is possible.
Well, that's the other amazing thing about this concept is you'll see new behaviors out of these animals that you would never see otherwise. And so I want to lay out some rules for success here if somebody's wanting to try this. What are some key points they need to hit? But first, are there things that are absolutely stay away from that can be broadly stated across the hobby, or is that too broad of a question? I'm not sure if anyone has any of those that you can just jump in if you want, but just like, if someone were to say, I'm going to try this, you say absolutely not. Are there any rules like that, or is that too broad?
If you have a species that's ophiophagous, that eats other snakes as part of their diet, I would not attempt to keep them together or keep that snake with a different species of snake. Why would you do that? So obviously right off the bat, I think that would be insane to do that. And then the other thing is I just would not try to keep 2 snakes. And again, that's the only reptile I've cohabitated in an enclosure that isn't big enough for 2. In other words, what enclosure size is appropriate for 1, and at least double it, if not triple it or quadruple it. So don't try to stick 2 snakes in an enclosure that's barely big enough for 1. I would not recommend that. I don't know what would happen. I don't want to find out what would happen. I just think it would be suboptimal.
Yeah. And then Joe, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, if somebody's, reptiles are often quoted as good pets for people who aren't around a lot. So people who they might go on weekends away regularly or something like that, which, is true, because you can just stick the lights on a timer, and if they're not a species that needs spraying down every day, or it's something that only eats once a week or less than that, then yeah, you're fine. But if you've got multiple animals in one enclosure where there's a possibility they're going to fall out, and you reckon you're going to be away for a week every month, then I'd maybe think about not doing it, because the most important thing about cohabbing is that you have the option to stop cohabbing at any moment. But if you're not there to see it that one day when things go wrong, then you're asking for trouble a bit, really.
Yeah, that is a really key point. And yeah, Francis, you have another one?
linking to things that both Joe and Laurie said. So with Laurie, Ophiophagous snakes, I agree in general. There's no hard and fast rules, but in general, why risk mixing snakes that are known snake eaters? That said, I know people personally who do keep king snakes, for example, the Jetula complex king snakes together. It can be done, but these people tend to be very experienced and knowledgeable keepers that know the signs, know what they're looking for. So for me, the first rule is if the snake is likely to be Ophiophagous, I agree with Laurie, it's probably best idea not to keep it with another snake. Mm-hmm. Coach whips are one which I was very worried about cohabiting. I do cohabit coach whips, but I'm aware that they will take sometimes very large snakes. I mixed them originally to try and breed them, but they actually work so well together, I now keep them in pairs or trios, and they do exceptionally well. Logically, though, we know that coach whips do eat smaller snakes, so it was something that I undertook very, very cautiously, and as Joe said, with a lot of observation. That links back to observation. If you don't know what you're looking for, then it's a non sequitur. It's like, first of all, this is not something that should be undertaken by an amateur that's new to reptiles. Mm-hmm. So that's the rule number one for me is, if this is your first reptile, or if you've just bought a reptile, learn to keep that reptile well first. Learn to identify its behavior, learn to cycle it, learn to know what its normal behavior or usual behavior patterns are, so that you can identify when you mix them and it starts exhibiting some other behavior patterns that are weird, that you realize that something is up and that this is new behavior. I'm not saying that all of these behaviors will be bad, but at least you'll have a knowledge, a basic working understanding of the species that you're keeping and how to keep it properly before you sort of get in over your head and start adding more to the collection. Again, with the size, obviously size is very important. The problem is this, though, if we take leopard geckos, one of the most commonly pet lizards, what you consider an adequate size for one leopard gecko might not be what I consider, or might not be what Joe Blows considers. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about doubling size. I think that you do need to add more size per animal, but it does depend on whether you're keeping a single animal. In the case of a leopard gecko, are you keeping that gecko in a small shoebox-sized tub, which is not really big enough for it to exhibit behaviors for a single animal, let alone multiple animals? Or are you keeping that single animal in a 3 or 4 foot long terrarium? In a 4 foot long terrarium, I'd argue that is actually big enough for a couple of leopard geckos. But I would also say that that's a decent size for one leopard gecko. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to size, it depends. I'm not going to say double the size for each animal, because I don't know what size you're keeping one animal in. And I think the biggest problem, the single biggest issue that happens when people cohabit is hard truth for reptile keepers. Most reptiles are not kept in particularly large enclosures for just one animal. I'm sorry, but having sort of moderated various forums and groups, the number one question that I see asked is, what's the minimum size I can keep such and such a reptile in? Mm-hmm. You can keep an animal in a minimum size, but if you're going to keep the animal in a minimum size, you can't mix another animal with it, because you're keeping it in the minimum size for one animal or less. You know, what I consider minimum size might not be what you consider minimum size. So that is sort of addressing those comments. And then finally, with snakes in particular, might be a contentious one, because again, it's not a hard and fast rule, but I personally would not mix snakes with other types of animals. Mm-hmm. So what I mean is, I'll happily mix frogs and lizards. That can be done quite easily. I'll mix lizards with other species of lizards. Snakes by their nature are predatory. They'll usually be larger than most of the other animals in the enclosure. Even snakes that might be used to eating mammal prey, say corn snakes or rat snakes, there's nothing saying that they are not going to take a small frog or a lizard either. They will. I mean, they might not do it often, but they will. And if it's kept in the same enclosure, odds are it might eat even a smaller snake. If it's another species of snake, I wouldn't mix them. There are a few exceptions, which I might give later on. But the thing is that a lot of animals are hardwired to be afraid of snakes. A good example would be Anolis lizards. They have a particular defensive display against snakes. So I've actually tried keeping rough green snakes, which are insectivorous mainly. with green animals. And I've actually noticed the animals get extremely stressed when they encounter the snake, and they'll start posturing and showing the dewlap and puffing themselves up. It's not the kind of behavior that you want to see, where every time these animals come into contact in the confinement of a terrarium, they're going to start facing off like that. And the snake will also obviously be stressed. I mean, rough green snakes aren't necessarily the easiest species to keep. So you don't want to be exacerbating that by having a stressful encounter with another animal that will be threatening it. So for me, one big rule is I don't mix one species of snake with anything else, with a few rare examples that maybe we'll go into later.
Yeah, I think those are some great some cautions that people should avoid. And, it's funny, yesterday I had my boa crawling around on the floor, and my day gecko, when she sees the snake, she just eyes lock onto it, and you can tell it stresses her out. She just, starts getting very twitchy, and, it looks a lot like, well, in the wild, like you said, animals are programmed to be afraid of snakes. So that's one thing to be cautious for. And obviously the keeper must be at a much higher level of engagement in order to pull any of this off successfully. Liam, did you have anything to add to sort of a do not try list? Is, any rules that you would, wrap with red tape?
The one thought that I had was, if you're a keeper that tries to avoid going to a vet at all costs, there's many keepers that refuse to ever go to a vet. I mean, you see people doing like surgeries on YouTube when they've got thousands in their pocket anyway to avoid going to a vet. So if you're a keeper that's going to avoid going to a vet, maybe don't cohabitate, which may or may not increase the likelihood of injuries and need for vet visits.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that is a great point.
There is one other point that I forgot to mention, which is probably the most important point of all: quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, growing up and going into the pet shops in the late 80s and 90s, it was kind of common that you'd see enclosures packed full of different kinds of lizards. So, for example, I remember going into a particular garden centre in Guildford and seeing African five-line skinks kept with collared lizards and Chilean curly-tailed lizards and a wall lizard, which had disappeared. I wonder why, because collared lizards will eat lizards as well. It used to be the dumb thing in pet shops where all these wild-caught lizards were just thrown into vivs at a similar size, and no thought was given whether or not they'd fight, whether they'd bite legs off each other. Obviously, you're mixing species from different habitats. That's one thing. But the other thing is quarantine. You're getting all these wild-caught animals. We place so much emphasis on quarantine. I mean, every animal that comes into your collection should be quarantined for a minimum of 3 months, up to a couple of years, and you should be sending fecals and swabs and so on for individual animals, and that includes from breeders, because even if it's been captive bred, you don't know what else that animal will have been exposed to, how close it's been kept with other animals. That will only be more of a problem if you're then mixing the animals. So although it's kind of it was the dumb thing where you'd get a lot of wild-caught animals like that, those green animals and the Chinese long-tailed lizards that I mentioned earlier, you'd mix them. And they're hardy enough that they will probably adapt and do okay. But you're mixing animals from two different corners of the world, probably have come in wild. You don't know what kind of parasites they'll be carrying. Always make sure that your animals have undergone quarantine first. Quarantine them individually or in groups of the same species if they've come in together. Because, of course, wild-caught animals will come in groups. You can quarantine groups of the same type of animal. But make sure that those animals are healthy and are eating well, and preferably that they'll eat from the tongs, so you can actually moderate each the intake that each of these animals gets individually. And then once they're quarantined and once you've done the work for getting rid of their parasites and making sure that they're healthy, then mix them, rather than just create more problems by mixing a bunch of wild-caught animals, perhaps, and oddly enough, I've noticed that it is generally the wild-caught animals that do tend to get mixed, which is a shame, because I think that a lot of people will be dooming themselves to failure from the beginning with that mindset. Whereas if you start with healthy animals, if they're captive bred or they've been quarantined for several years, then that's a much better, stronger foundation and basis to be undertaking that kind of endeavor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is an excellent point. You want to jump in there, Liam?
I was going to say that just comes back to saying how about looking after the individual animal well first.
Mm-hmm.
If they've already got parasites and whatnot, you shouldn't be even thinking about cohabitation. I mean, to add to that, I mean the genes, the MHC diversity and everything will be highly localized to pathogens from that environment that those genes evolved in. So opposite ends of the earth, they do not have anything that is adapted to the pathogens from that areas. So you're actually creating the worst possible scenario if you've got diseases from opposite ends of the earth.
Yeah, it's like a smallpox situation in North America, so you do have to be very careful. So now that I think those are some great rules that people absolutely need to follow, and then let's talk about how people can have success in this domain. We've kind of started talking about enclosure size. Is there anything else that's left unsaid there? Because it's kind of like we said, it's tough to talk about it when we're not specifically talking about one species. We're talking about generally. Joe, it look like you were about to say something?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I suppose I'll before I get into a rant, I'll well, not really a rant, but you know what I mean. I thought I'd add that talking about things being afraid of snakes. I think I showed this in a video I did recently, but my bearded dragon hates me calling snake. He sees him on the other side of the room. His beard's out, black, puffed up. It's just things don't like snakes, so just don't go down that route. And
apart from us weirdos,
hey.
Apart from us weirdos.
Yeah, apart from the humans.
Yeah. But the other thing was about disease as an example. This is just sort of a bit of trivia, really, but I think chytrid fungus in frogs, I think I'm correct in saying originated in Xenopus, the clawed frogs, the aquatic ones from Africa. Are popular lab animals and in fish tanks everywhere. I think it originated in them, and then people having them all around the world. I think that is what originally made chytrid get out all over the place. So, this idea of having diseases and other animals in other parts of the world not being used to it or immune to it in any way, shape or form, it's sort of exemplified in one of the worst diseases we know of in the entirety of herphood, as it were.
And to be honest, that is one of the issues I personally have with outdoor keeping. I mean, I think outdoor keeping is great. I worry about the mentality of introducing, and it's a shame that Harvey isn't here because I know that he keeps outdoors, but I worry about the mentality of, especially with amphibians, it has to be said, where you're putting amphibians from all over the world. Europe, there's lots of European, but even Asian amphibians are being kept outdoors here in the UK. We have had various populations of sort of escaped amphibians, for example, the midwife toads that are in some parts of the UK now. It does make me worry, especially as alpine newts, for example, have also been thought to be one of the vectors of BSAL. Whether or not that came about from outdoor keeping per se or from the release of these newts via other means, I don't know. But if you're putting animals in an outdoor situation, it is something that I've thought about, to be honest, especially when it comes to amphibians. I'm not so sure it's always a good idea. But again, that's kind of a sort of off topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Harvey and Tom have these crazy protocols that they go through in order to make sure that their facility is clean. And so that was hoping he'd be here to talk about that. So maybe we'll force him to make a short video on their channel that supplement this to talk about what specifically they do to make sure that they're not going to contribute to a problem like that, because it's a super good point. And Joe, do you want to finish off that enclosure size?
I was actually going to say about, I thought it would be nice to bring things up to speed a little bit with them. We've talked a lot already about why cohabbing might go wrong, what you shouldn't do with cohabbing, why cohabbing's bad. And I thought to add to that list of negativity, I'd talk about the sort of typical reasons why people say you shouldn't cohab. Because, I mean, you've watched to this point in the podcast, so you probably already know what cohabbing is and have a fair idea, but just to set the scene, like somebody will go on an internet forum or they'll go and ask in somebody's YouTube comments or something like that, and they'll go, I've got a leopard gecko, I'd like another. Can I put it in the same enclosure as my other one? Or somebody will go, I've got 3 bearded dragons and they're all living together nicely in a 40-gallon. Do you reckon I could put a 4th in there? Well, etc., etc. And then people come along and just absolutely bash them, saying you can't keep them together like that. Whatever you're going to do, they're going to fight to the death. If you've got two males, they're just going to straight up fight with each other. If you've got multiple females, well, they might fight with each other, so just don't do it. And if you've got a male and several females, the male is going to continually want to breed with the female, stress her out, and it's just going to be a bad day at the office. So I suppose with that in mind, if people haven't really heard much more about cohabiting, with that sort of general argument already being given, you might be wondering, why are we talking about cohabiting at all? If cohabiting has got all of these downsides to it, and we've just spent all of this time already talking about reasons why you shouldn't cohab, why would we want to cohab at all? And so I think I'd just put that out there as an open-ended question.
Yeah, if anyone wants to jump in on that, go for it.
I will, but I'll let others jump in first, I think.
Well, before we move on to that, while we were talking about some health things, I just wanted to make sure and point out, I mean, obviously, I advocate for doing what's best from the animal standpoint for the animals. And so there's cohabiting from the animal standpoint. And in that respect, you're going to look for things like general health, any agonistic behavior. Is there a social benefit to it? Etc. But then there's also from the keeper standpoint. And it can actually be kind of a pain from a keeper standpoint if you're trying to monitor health. So which one produced urates? Which one produced feces? If I'm collecting stool samples to test them, how do I know which animal that came from? If the animals spend a lot of time together, it can be difficult to know which one shed. And that sounds strange, but I do have one pair that spends a phenomenal amount of time together. And when one goes into blue, the other one will actually hide with it. So then I'm like, well, which one actually just shed? If I'm not being intrusive and looking in there constantly to see which one's actually in blue. And then if one were to happen to regurge, how do you know which one did that? So there are these things that are difficult to monitor if you have two together. The other thing that can be challenging is feeding. So do you separate to feed? Do you try to feed them both in the enclosure? And if the animals are not tame, because I do work with a few that aren't tame, it can be very challenging to separate them for feeding. And then I do a lot of training with the animals, and it can be challenging to train one while there's another one there. So those are just some of the things from a keeper standpoint that people need to think about. If you can't adequately manage one animal and know everything about that animal's health and behavior, then don't try to watch two at once, because it can be difficult and challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's important to state, because a lot of people, they either look at cohabiting as a way of having more animals in a limited space. So of course, if you can double up the same enclosure, you can fit two in instead of one. It's not the right mindset to have. Cohabiting is harder than keeping them singly. I can cohabit many of the animals that I keep, and I have done in the past, but at the moment I've got them kept simply for that reason. It's simpler to do it. Others I still cohabit. It is, so the first thing to bear in mind, cohabiting isn't something that you want to get into if you're interested in doing things on the cheap or in saving space, because the room that you would need to cohabit will be larger than the sum of its parts, more usually than not. Mm-hmm. That said, going to Joseph's question, which is very good. There are lots of reasons not to cohab. And as I said at the beginning, if you don't want to cohab, don't cohab. It is simpler and easier to keep most reptiles or amphibians singly. It is. If you are a beginner keeper or an amateur keeper, or you just don't feel confident cohabiting, don't. However, that doesn't mean that it is impossible to cohab or that there are no benefits to cohabiting. The problem is that in the reptile hobby, there are lots of basic rules that beginner keepers sort of get taught. And the problem is, rather than advancing their knowledge base, they kind of get stuck in this rut of staying at the same level. So, for example, substrates, for example, there's that myth where lizards will always get impacted if they hit on loose substrates. So people don't keep them on loose substrates to negate that risk. There are reasons that impaction happens, and there are ways of mitigating impaction. impaction itself is a symptom of poor husbandry, not directly as a result from being kept on loose substrate. Impaction can also happen on insect chitin. I've seen impaction happen from newspaper or kitchen towel that they've also been kept on. So impaction can happen in many different ways. It's not just loose substrate. So if you've sort of cut your teeth on this basic rule of impaction, that's fine. If you don't want to use loose substrate throughout your keeping career, don't. That doesn't mean that you can't keep on loose substrate. And cohabitation is very similar. If you want to keep things simple at the beginning, that's good. I would advise on that. But that doesn't mean that you cannot cohabit, or that you cannot cohabit extremely successfully. I mean, I've got animals there that have been cohabiting without issue for 20 odd years, literally 2 decades. That's, to put it bluntly, that's older than some of the people that will criticize cohabiting if I put pictures of it. And these animals are healthy and doing very well. They breed multiple times. They don't have any kind of issues. So the main problem with this anti-cohab sort of mindset is it's the idea that reptiles are asocial. Reptiles are not asocial. They may have less sociality than some mammals or some insects even, but we don't know enough about their sociality simply because it's relatively unstudied, and the types of cues and signals that they will utilize within that sociality are outside of our perception. So chemosensory cues, many of these animals see ultraviolet. So if you look at lizards, many lizards have a heap of ultraviolet markings on their body that you will never see. But to a conspecific, they can see them, and it will affect their behavior towards them. They are patterned literally to communicate with one another. We know that tortoises, hognose snakes, bearded dragons, leopard geckos will follow the gaze of a conspecific, of another animal of their same species, and will learn from it. So they're actually capable of learning through observation of another conspecific. I've actually sort of seen this, and I never used to write about it much because I always used to fear this idea of getting accused of anthropomorphism. The thing is, though, it's not anthropomorphism. You can actually see, Anna Wilkinson has done a variety of studies with bearded dragons, with red-footed tortoises, with leopard geckos, where they've actually noted and seen that these animals will learn from observing another animal. If these animals are learning from one another, learning by observation has been postulated as one of the precursors to sociality. It's how sociality arises. Because if you're able to gather information that impacts your survival by watching another animal doing something, that's a good thing. Because we don't know very much about sociality in reptiles, people seem to believe that it isn't there. But with gregarious species, they should have the opportunity to interact with conspecifics, in my opinion, and in the opinions of others. Because if you're denying them that, then living individually might be detrimental to their cognitive well-being. So that's one reason. One reason is we constantly go on about this idea of enrichment and allowing them to indulge in their species-specific behaviors. Well, sociality is one of those things. Mm-hmm. Second reason is we may not know enough about how these animals interact in ways that would surprise. So, for example, there's a species of gecko, and I'm not even going to say that it's the only species of gecko. It's just one that's particularly well studied. Nephrurus millide. It's one of the knob-tailed geckos from Australia. Now, they've been observed to huddle together in the cracks and crevices where they live. Now, it gets very cold where they come from at night. And what has been found is that the animals that are allowed to huddle together, they lose temperature and gain temperature at different rates than the animals that are kept in isolation. So this may be another reason why sociality arises, because it allows them to indulge in a way to sort of get past the restrictions inherent in poikilothermy, in being cold-blooded. So you've got enrichment, so allowing to display behaviors. You have the behaviors themselves. You have cognitive functions. So going back to this idea of gaze following, young iguanas, for example, when they're hatched, they move around together for quite some time after hatching. There is an element of social learning and even altruism. So I've spoken about amphisbaenians once before, I think, on the previous video. So the amphisbaenian is a lizard that looks like a worm. It's found in, I used to find them in Gibraltar and Spain, but they're found more or less worldwide. And if you look at it, you'd think it's the most boring reptile going. It's literally an animal that lives in the soil that you sometimes see if you turn over rocks. That animal has actually one of the most interesting social lives because the males will emit a substance called squalene and the females will emit tocopherol. Because these animals have very few predators and because they live in an environment where they are so energy efficient, they can actually choose what meals to eat. So they can pass over meals that are less energy efficient in favor of waiting for a better meal that they can tackle that will give them more energy for the amount of energy they expend. If they come across a source of good food, they will actually signify conspecifics to come and make use of that as well. So there's an element of altruism in that, which is really interesting. We just don't know the kind of chemosensory cues that a lot of these animals display and interact with. So that in itself is a reason that I think sociality should be tried. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If it's simpler not to, then that. But don't criticize the people that do it because they sometimes come across behaviors that are undocumented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is where the concept of really understanding the natural history of the animals that you're working with is so key. And right now, obviously, we're sort of focusing on those benefits of the conspecifics because that's where it's more obvious on the social side. I'm not sure, Lori, did you have anything to add to that? Because obviously we're touching on behavior here, and normally that's where your brain lights up.
Yeah, I wrote down a few notes. So I want to not forget to say right off the bat that research indicates there are some species that we know in the wild are social. Many species of rattlesnakes, garter snakes, we know that they are living communally and they're social. And so when we know that for sure, as certain as we do, and a lot of research has been done with those species and how they live communally, then I think that we should be keeping them communally under captive management because it might be detrimental to their welfare to keep a single individual when that isn't part of their natural history. But with some of these other species, it is a little bit more ambiguous because it's not such an outright obvious thing that other species of reptiles or snakes are social. They obviously have some aspect of sociality to them or they wouldn't ever breed. But the benefits of as far as the social benefit, if it's a species that we know cohabitate in the wild, then absolutely we should be giving them that opportunity under captive management. There can also be enrichment benefits as far as just mental stimulation of having a conspecific there, even if you're not spending a lot of time together. Just their presence is going to be somewhat enriching. And it's also going to probably give you more exercise because you're going to be moving in relation to how that other animal's moving. Social learning is a thing. It happens in all animals. It's been well documented, even in fish and insects, reptiles, amphibians, as well as mammals. So it absolutely is something that happens. A study just came out earlier this year, and I know we're only in March, but it came out like in January. I think it involved bearded dragons learning how to open a door by watching one conspecific do it. So there's absolutely no doubt that they do learn this way. And then something that I observed in the statistics that we were keeping is that younger animals tend to spend more time together than when they get older, such as in the corn snakes, the carpet pythons, and the rainbow boas. They spent a lot more time together when they were young, say under 18 months to 2 years old, than when they got older. Then they started spending more time apart. With the exception of the inland carpet pythons I have, which are going on 3 years old, they're still there. And I also still notice even the adults, if there's been some upset to their routine, like I've cleaned or added enclosure furnishings, or they've come out for exercise, or they've just eaten, they will always find each other when they go back and spend a few hours together before they go their separate ways again. And it makes me speculate if that's for security, if part of that isn't for security, because they spend time together when they're young and not so much when they're older. And then after there's been some upset to their routine, they will spend time together again. And that is purely speculation on my part, but it just makes me think, well, is that because they want to feel secure and then they realize everything's okay and they go about their business again?
So what about, I don't want to send us on a different tangent. If anyone else has a point to make on this one, they're welcome to do that. But I'll just add another point to this topic. Is we're talking about the benefits of conspecific cohabiting. What about, are there any benefits to heterospecific cohabiting, as in, having different species in the same enclosure, or is that purely a keeper benefit? So if anyone has anything to finish off on the conspecific, they're welcome to. And then as far as
the only thing I will say, I don't do that, but the one of the local zoos here, which I have a lot of respect for, they're a very nice zoo. They've been keeping a bull snake, a Pituophis catenifersae, together with two box turtles for as long as I've been visiting the zoo, like years.
And that's actually a really good example.
At least 10 years, those have been together.
That genus actually lives in the burrows of burrowing turtles as well. So gopher snakes live with gopher tortoises and so on. So I think that's actually a really good example of cohabiting done right. They're from a similar environment and they would cohabit with similar animals in the wild. Going back to the conspecifics, I mean, you brought up the crash behavior in rattlesnakes. So Rulon Clark of Cornell University is the one that's done a lot of work on that. And yeah, I mean, there are lots of snakes that actually recognize not just conspecifics, but kin. So within conspecifics themselves, they can identify familiar individuals or related individuals. And that's been shown with garter snakes and rattlesnakes at least. I think Morgan Skinner brought out a paper last year or the year before where he actually showed that garter snakes actually have not just a preference for cohabiting with the same species, but they'll actually have favorite individuals that they will choose above and beyond other, and they will tend to hide in the same place as these familiar individuals. There was another study by Sakata et al. That showed the same thing with leopard geckos. Leopard gecko males not only will their behavior change once they have been allowed to cohabit with other leopard geckos, which is reason in and of itself to cohabit them, in my opinion, they will actually show a preference with familiar animals as opposed to strangers. And again, with the our own sort of first-hand anecdotal information, I've seen a very similar thing with a genus of snakes called Spalerosophis, which are diadem snakes. And it was actually something that was corroborated to me by a very nice fellow called Martin Haybecker, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, where diadem snakes will actually do group behavior as well. So they're fairly irritable and irascible snakes in general, but they tame down. None of the ones I have hiss much anymore. It used to be that if one started hissing, all of them in the room, and I had about 6 of them in various enclosures dotted throughout the room, they would all start hissing at the same time, which I found really interesting. Firstly, snakes don't hear very well, so I don't know how they would actually know that the snake's hissing. Could be that they're viewing the defensive behaviors that these snakes do as well. But they would actually mount what could be, again, it's speculation, but it could be a group defense. And I found that very interesting that was corroborated by somebody else that also kept that species. There is one other example that I want to give that I always give when we talk about sociality in snakes. And it's actually one of the most interesting social behaviors that I know of in reptiles. I mean, people will talk about sociality in lizards, the Australian dwarf blue-tongued skinks or sleepy lizards, and they talk about Edgernia skinks. But there aren't very many examples of snakes acting, or not as many snakes acting truly socially. But there is one genus which I happen to keep a lot of, which are the Somophids. And they have behaviors that, frankly, if you didn't know about them, you would. So among this family, you've got Montpellier snakes, which they're a rear-fang species down in southern France and Spain, across Mediterranean Europe and North Africa, and throughout Middle East. And this species actually, it produces a secretion which has a lot of pheromones and lipids from an aerial valve just in front of the eyes. And then not only will rub it over landmarks within their territory, so they'll form a territory where they'll actually mark these landmarks to delineate their territory, they'll actually rub it on themselves, which is a really interesting behavior to note, where they will rub their flanks and their vents with their noses. Now, what they do is they will then patrol their territory, and the pheromones and lipids will rub off around them and show other snakes that they are there. Females, so one male will have a territory that commands the territory of several females. The females will pair bond with the male after the male actually catches prey and presents it to them. So, and there's video of this, which is I've actually shared on my YouTube channel, which was the King of Provence film done in German, where they actually show you a male catching a mouse and presenting it to the female to eat, which I think is an amazing thing. I don't think there's another example of sociality quite to that extent in snakes. The females will also take cover and hide under the male when threatened. So, for example, if the bird flies overhead, the female will squeeze under the male. But what's really interesting is that when another male intrudes upon the male Montpellier snake's territory, they will fight, and a lot of snakes will fight, they'll wrestle and so on. You've seen whip snakes do it, and gopher and bull snakes and various rat snakes and rattlesnakes do it, vipers. But with Montpellier snakes, the defeated male doesn't just push off. The winner will actually take the male, the defeated male, as a vassal, who will then help him protect the territory from other males. What the mechanism is that sort of decides how these vassals are chosen, whether it's perhaps degree of relatedness, I don't think has been studied fully. Although if anyone would be in the know, it would be a gentleman called Cornelius de Haan. But other than possibly king cobra's pair bonding, I don't know of a social relationship between two snakes that strong. Maybe somebody will correct me, but sociality is there. It's studied particularly well in some ophids. I mean, this is a whole family of snakes that exhibit similar behaviors, although the Montpellier snake sort of is extreme even among them. But there's so much that we don't know that we can't just say, as we've said, there are many examples of sociality across reptilia. I'll stop ranting.
No, that is really fascinating. Wow. Liam, looks like you want to...
There was a species, I saw something about that with, what species was it? I think it was Egyptian false cobra. I saw something similar about...
Yeah, that's another type of Malpolon moilensis.
Yeah,
which is relative to the Montpellier snake.
Joe, did you have anything to add to the benefits? I wasn't sure if you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I did... going back slightly far now, it's the observational learning thing. I might have even talked about this anecdote on a different podcast before, but I'll do it again because this was actually the first time me and Laurie had any communication, because I made a video about it, about reptile intelligence. It's when the first time I had leopard geckos kept together, which was actually the two females which I had together, which I've had together for over a year now, because they were in quarantine together for like 6 months before I put them in with me existing male, as per what we said earlier in the podcast about quarantining. But when I had those together, one female was particularly bold and the other was particularly shy. So the one that was shy, I didn't see particularly much at all. And the one which was bold was constantly wanting to get out. And so... at the time, in case anybody wonders this, you might be thinking, well, that female that was constantly wanting out, was she being bullied by the other female? That did enter my head, but I hadn't seen any negative interaction between them. So, but one time when I was trying to feed these lizards, the bold female decided to climb up the feeding tongs, ignore the food, that wasn't interesting, went straight up my hand and came out the enclosure, just came up my arm like that. And it was a nice thing to happen. It was quite interesting. I just, took her out for a couple of minutes, put her back. But the thing was, the very next day, the shy female, who I never really saw up until that point, had been watching the other female from inside a hide, and the next day she did the same thing, even though I barely saw her. Now, there's no way that I could explain that. Mm-hmm. There's this shy lizard that I don't see, watches another lizard do something, and the next day does the same. Can only be learning in my book, really. And to that end, going on with the leopard geckos a bit more is because they're out of hibernation and have been for getting on for a month now, and I've seen them together. And really, the interaction between them it's really calm, really gentle. You know, they're a bit, dare I say it, they're a bit dizzy when it comes to food. If something moves, their eyes go wide and they go straight up to it. And they often do that. If they see me come in the room, they get all let up. They're all excited. They're wanting to eat. And then they see another lizard on the other side of the enclosure moving and think that's it. So they go straight over. But then when they're together, they will go up to each other, lick each other's faces, and then go calm. And it's like, okay, it's just you. You're not food. And then they carry on as normal. So it's like they obviously recognize each other as not being food. They're not just blindly attacking things. They do accidentally nip each other occasionally, which I would say it's not really a major downside because they do let go. I mean, they have behaviors for telling each other, look, I'm not food, let go, please. And what they do is they'll thrash the tail like that really madly. And the one that's got old will just let go at that point. You know, so it's just, they're learning from each other. They recognize each other. If things go wrong with food, then they have behaviors where they just get out of it. So it really, for me, it just paints a completely different picture to these dumb animals that just recognize movement. That's food, that, and can't understand each other's actions. They're far more intelligent than that. And I think the leopard geckos also provide a brilliant example of us not understanding how other creatures see the world and how that necessarily feeds into their intelligence. So we're visually based animals. We see things first. We smell them and hear them later. I suppose we contact things and we're quite tactile, but we're driven by sight. Leopard geckos aren't. They're driven by the noses. When the first inkling I got of how strong this was is my male leopard gecko. If I chuck locusts or crickets or something in the enclosure, he won't really see them even if they're out. But a really interesting behaviour is he'll tip his head up vertically as if he's sniffing the air, walk around a bit randomly until he gets something, and he'll smell it and go for it. So the sense of smell is obviously very good, because I must say I did not know that locusts had a smell to them. I've never smelt them. I mean, I don't know that I've tried, but these things are obviously they're in tune with their environment through the noses, and they're licking all the time. Another thing I've seen them do is with it being in a bioactive enclosure, the mealworms in there will bury themselves in the soil and turn into pupae and then come out. I've witnessed the male sniffing round, starting digging at an apparently random place and come up with a mealworm pupa. So he's not just smelling it on the open, that's buried in the soil. So these things are so acute. And, you see him scent marking, the male will rub his femoral paws against the ground. How much information are they sharing between each other that we just don't have a clue about? Maybe they've got a language that's driven in scents, and how are we going to know?
I mean, exactly. This is the chemosensory smell in leopard geckos is one of the more well-studied. I was going to ask when you mentioned the face licking, because I actually shared photos of that a few years ago myself on Advancing Herpetological Husbandry. I thought it was a really interesting behavior. And because these animals are using their tongue and their vomer and nasal gland to sense the world around them. So when you see them actually going up face to face and you think, oh God, is one of them going to bite the other one? No, they just start licking each other. They're literally identifying one another. And this ties back to the study I mentioned by Sakata. They are familiar with one another. They can identify individuals and discriminate between individuals of their own species. So, of course, it makes sense that they will meet one another, and then, depending on what they're confronted with, is it somebody familiar? Yes, okay, I'm calm. Are they not familiar? Okay, now I might start puffing myself up and waving my tail around and demonstrating these agonistic behaviors that leopard geckos are famous for. So yeah, it is a really interesting observation. I've made that observation myself, so I'm happy that you brought it up. Again, with these observations, I was going to mention anthropomorphism earlier, because there have been a lot of things that I've noticed that sometimes I just haven't bothered sharing them, because of course they can be interpreted in many different ways. But when you've brought this up about the leopard gecko escaping by watching another leopard gecko, I think I was leading into it earlier and I kind of got sidetracked, as I do. But I breed grass snakes, just bog standard European grass snakes. And many years ago, I remember having a tank full of them. It's just a fish tank type enclosure with many of the babies. And what I noticed was that one of the babies was actually stuck against the glass. And I think this is quite common in semi-aquatic snakes, where they will actually get themselves wet and then they'll make a sort of concave shape with their vent and use that to climb plants and surfaces. It makes basically a suction cup effect. What I noticed was that this snake in particular fell down multiple times, but each time it fell down, it would crawl into its water bowl before trying to make the climb again. So it seemed to know that if it needed to be wet for this effect to happen. But what was more interesting was that there were 26 baby snakes in that big tank. One day I noticed one doing that. The next day, all of the snakes were doing it. So it wasn't, within the space of a day, all of the snakes were suddenly, where they had not displayed this behavior for weeks before, they were suddenly climbing as well, and they were all doing the same thing, going back into the water bowl and climbing up. And it's something I really wish I had documented, but it's one of these anecdotes that you'll have to bring up and people can either believe it or not. I'm aware that water snakes and Nerodia do it as well, do use this behavior to climb. So it is a legitimate behavior. But the idea that all of the snakes, all 26 animals, learn to do it on the same day within 12 to 24 hours, that is interesting. That makes me sort of think more that, these animals are capable of observing one another and copying at the very least.
Well, and I wonder how much of that observational learning is, maybe not in that example because they're all babies, but in the example that Joe has, where, is that observational learning tilted towards watching the dominant animals and sort of hyper learning from those individuals? You have the subdominant animals. This is just a total theory coming up to the top of my head. If you have subdominant animals in a colony, are they watching the dominant individuals for what to do? I don't know. I'm not sure if there's any evidence on that at all. But
it's an interesting point, that, because I've never really thought about this one, and this one's really tentative. But I'll put it out there. It's my male leopard gecko, Speckles, who's the dominant one. He's much bigger than the females, the two females I've got with him. He has learned that, because I have like a plastic cup that I put feeder insects in to dust them. He knows the sound of that, like the of the crickets go, or whatever it is going round in there. And he goes hyper when he hears that sound. It's upsetting for him if I'm feeding something else in the room, because then he doesn't get anything. But in any case, he comes out, he goes mad. But the females, when I had them on their own from February till August, they never really picked up on that sound. I didn't have all three of them together very much before they went into hibernation, so they weren't feeding much. But this year, I've only fed them 3 times, and the females are already getting excited when they hear that noise. So there's a potential there. Are they seeing the male get excited and copying? Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's too weak, that, but
Lori might have
I'll put it out there.
So here's the thing that
so there's more than one type of observational learning. So there's imitation and copying and emulation, and there's a whole list of different ways that animals learn through this mechanism of social learning. And so that is the question. But what you've just generated, there's a testable hypothesis. And I wanted to comment on this idea of constructive anthropomorphism, which is sort of, we don't need to just dispel anthropomorphism, because we're all vertebrates and we're all animals that live on this planet. And it's logical to look at an animal's behavior and think the animal's doing this because of this reason, because if I was doing that, that's why I would be doing it. There is nothing wrong with that, as long as you can pull from that speculation a testable hypothesis. If I think the animal is behaving this way because it's hungry or thirsty or wants out, is there something in there that I can test to determine if my assumption is correct or not? And so what
That's a
Joe's
great
saying
point.
is that that's some observational learning going on. And now you want to take it further and test, well, what type of observational learning is happening there? And you could test that.
And with the anthropomorphism, I mean, I personally find this idea that anthropomorphism is so bad. I mean, it's almost like an ingrained instinct now that we've got to immediately distance ourselves from any animal displaying any behavior as anthropomorphic. Mm-hmm. That in itself is a source of bias because you're treating the animals as machines. I would actually say that that is a more dangerous bias than anthropomorphism, which is mechanomorphism. I mean, Berghardt has written, about this idea of critical anthropomorphism. And I agree. If it's testable and measurable, it doesn't matter. This idea of critical anthropomorphism, it's an important one. If you treat the animal as a machine and you view it as a purely instinctual being, are you more or less likely to give that animal correct welfare? Well, from what I've observed, I think you're less likely to want to give that animal better welfare if you treat it as being a completely instinctual creature that can survive in a box with some newspaper and a water bowl, as opposed to someone who may anthropomorphize their animals. And there are extremes. Obviously, too much anthropomorphism is bad as well. You don't want beardies kept in dolls' houses or people like picking up their snakes and stroking them and just watching TV with them.
As soon as you pull out the hats, it's gone too far.
Yeah. But it is okay to see something and think, you know what, that's something interesting. As long as it can be tested, as long as you have a rational hypothesis for why it's happening. This word anthropomorphism gets bandied around too much, to the point that it is in itself a source of bias against this idea that reptiles can learn and display cognitive complexity, which we know they do. That it's been measured and tested. There's no argument that these animals, they identify one another. They can learn to do all kinds of complex behaviors. I mean, snakes, I would never have thought it, but snakes can learn to press buttons for food. It's been demonstrated on at least 3 different taxa: king snakes, indigo snakes, and Burmese pythons. A lot of people just would not believe that is happening, and it happens. They can associate a contact relay. They can learn, from watching other conspecifics. It's time to stop using this word anthropomorphism as a pejorative, so to speak. I mean, obviously, there's extremes in both directions, but I think it's better to be slightly anthropomorphic than to veer more into mechanomorphic and take away from these animals in behaviors that they do possess.
Yeah. Go ahead, Liam.
The irony is that the people that bound around that word so much are those that don't understand the word.
Yes.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, it does become a pejorative. That's the exact word that I was going to use. It becomes an insult and a way to deflect any advancing care that gets thrown away. So this is great. We're having an awesome discussion. I want to wheel us back a little bit into. There's a question that I posed probably about an hour ago, and I don't think there's an answer to this question, but I want to touch back on the enclosure size just in case if there's a rule of thumb that people can follow. I assume the rule of thumb is just larger than you expect or larger than you think. Is there any points that anyone wants to make that's just a real quick point to add to that?
I have a question real quick for Liam, because Liam worked in a shop where the reptiles presumably are not kept in large spaces and they're not probably kept under optimal conditions. So what type of behavior did you observe from the reptiles kept under shop conditions? Did you observe injuries, agonistic behavior, bullying, combat, poor eating, anything that we would deem as indicators of poor welfare?
Depends on the species, actually. I know that Borneo short-tailed pythons were cohabitors. I was there, and I think it was only in a Exoterra, probably 90 long, I think it was, and didn't see anything from those, but they were quite poor eaters, and I wonder how much that came to play. Chameleons a lot. They would shove a lot of chameleons in together. You'd always have the one that sat there fine, and the other one that's black and sat in the corner. angry at the world. So you can imagine how much that affected that. But leopard geckos, they got put in together. I didn't see any antagonistic behavior with that. Trying to think, quite a lot actually was cohabs, but I didn't actually see a lot, to be honest, apart from the chameleons and maybe the short tails being finicky with eating. There's not a lot that actually gave problems. Well, I will say that I wasn't actually full time. I was part time, so there was days where I would obviously not go in, and then so I wasn't there like 7 days a week. So maybe I may have missed the days where there was antagonistic behavior, but for the most part, I didn't really see much.
Is it worth pointing out as well that with shops, the stock is often juvenile when sort of territories wouldn't actually be set up yet between animals? Like, I suppose bearded dragons are a fairly good example where adult males are pretty likely to go at each other. But if you stick juvies together in a viv in a shop and they're only there for a couple of months, well, you're going to get away with it.
Well, tying into that as well, they tend to be overstocked. So if you've got, a complete oversaturation of animals in a space, there's no way that territories can be delineated and set up. So they may just be too stressed to enact this kind of like dominance behavior because there's so many. If you go into wholesalers, they sometimes have bins with hundreds of lizards, before they go out to the pet shops. Those animals are not going to start demonstrating natural behaviors as such because they're so overcrowded that they can't.
So are there any answers to the enclosure question, or just large? Is that? Oh, do you want to finish that, Joe?
I do have a. I know there's. I think there's. Well, I won't point because they might be different on other people's screens. But there's other points. So I'll say this one quick. Is the line day geckos I've got are a pretty good example of. I used to have them in a 40 by 40 by 50 centimeter enclosure, which is, a bit smaller than an 18 by 18 by 24 for inch people. But bearing in mind this is a gecko this big, including the tail, and I've moved them into a 90 by 45 by 90 centimeter enclosure, which is 36 by 18 by 36 for inch people. And in the small enclosure, the two females didn't get on, but they got on fine with the male. In the new enclosure, the females still don't get on and absolutely just bully each other, but they both get on fine with the male. I'll talk more about that if we come on to it a bit later. But it is one really interesting thing I can't move past is that the male seems to act like an intermediary with the aggression between the females. If the male is out and the subordinate female, who is actually the one that breeds the most and lays a pair of eggs every month, if the male is out, she will go and sit by him so that if the dominant female wants to come and have a go at her, she has to go through the male in order to do that. So it's like the subordinate female uses the male as a block.
Shield.
Yeah,
I mean, you've got to remember as well that females can be territorial as well. And this is, with cohabiting, people always blame the male. Maybe the commonest example would be one male and several females, which is logical because if you're mixing a male and a female, the male will be trying to mate with female. If you've got more than one female, generally in snakes, for example, it spreads out the male's amorous advances, so to speak, between several animals, hopefully, so that he doesn't constantly stress out one female chasing. And a male that wants to mate can be very persistent, especially in a small enclosure. I'm sorry, Dylan, we will get to the size of the enclosure in a moment. But with many animals, with lizards, especially lacertids and geckos, I've noticed is it's not just cohabitation with one male and many females. It's a pair bond. So you have one male, one female, and they will defend against any other interloper, be it a male or a female. You can see this in eyed lizards, Timon, many lacertid lizards. I mean, if you actually go out in spring to look at Samodromus, Eremias, Acanthodactylus, Podarchis, all these different genera of lacertid lizards, you will find pair bonds. You'll find a male and a female basking and sitting together, and that's it. You won't see groups. Occasionally, you'll see young animals with them. I don't know whether they're related, but in terms of adults, that is the most common denominator I see, a male and a female basking together. And I've seen that North Africa, China with Eremias lizards. I've seen that with wall lizards in all over the Mediterranean. I've seen it with Algyroides lizards in Greece. You see the male and the female, and you see the same with many geckos as well. So this is one of the things I noted when I was growing up with Moorish geckos, especially, which I used to have on my house. You'd have a male and a female. The male was usually much beefier than the female, and they would defend against other interlopers, even females. So the female can be territorial, and this is where knowing the species and knowing the individual is important, and why I don't recommend cohabiting for somebody that hasn't kept the animal for a certain period beforehand. It's not as simple as male and several females, or females can be cohabited, because they can't always. Sometimes females will fight among themselves. Sometimes two males can be kept together. There's always exceptions. Going to Dylan's question about size, I'm very sorry, we're all digressing because the subject is so big. Mm-hmm. You could write a book about cohabitation. There's so many nuances to it, which is why it may be easier not to do it. I don't judge for that, but it can be very rewarding if you do it. With size, it falls back to what you're keeping and what you consider adequate for one animal. For me personally, if I'm keeping a snake, the enclosure has to be as long as the snake is. That's my minimum. And often I will have an enclosure much larger than that. So, I've got Dion's rat snakes behind me, which are between 24 and 30 inches, and they're all in 4-foot vivs. So that's a good deal bigger than them. You could cohabit those. I wouldn't mix a male with a female in those. I'd say that would be big enough for a pair, but in that species, I'd mix two females, or perhaps two males. I wouldn't mix one male and one female, because the males tend to bother the females, and it's not big enough for more than one male, one female. So there's no hard and fast rule. That's the unfortunate side, and that's why a lot of people prefer to avoid it, because there isn't a hard and fast rule. What might work for one person might not work for the next. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, carry on.
If you are of the mindset that you're asking what's the minimum to keep a snake in, that's fine. If you're keeping to that minimum, it's a minimum. That's fine. I'm not going to judge it, but you can't also put another snake in. Yeah, it's the same with lizards. If you're of the mindset that you want to devote half a room to a small species, which people do, you see people keeping royal pythons in 8 by 4 by 4 foot. That's big enough for a pair, and royal pythons can cohabit. They do it quite well, actually. It can be done very successfully, despite what you may read elsewhere. Royal pythons happen to actually cohabit in the wild for at least 5 or 6 months of the year when they estivate and when they are breeding. Mm-hmm. So that's already half a year that they would be together anyway. So I'd actually consider royal pythons one of the better examples that you can cohabit with conspecifics, assuming that they are healthy animals that are doing well and that are feeding well.
With
then, you can cohabit those.
Yeah.
A lot of people will say that you can't, but you can. Philippe de Vosjoli wrote about it, and he had best successes actually back in the 70s with wild courts coming in, and he used to keep them in groups, and they did best for him that way.
That's interesting.
Liam, do you have something there?
I wanted to throw a spanner in the works.
Oh my gosh, here we go.
Perhaps rather than, yes, size is important, but perhaps the habitat complexity and how three-dimensional and usable the space is more important than the size. If you have like a 6-foot vivarium with nothing in it apart from a hide and just empty space in the middle, then that maybe isn't as good for cohabiting a pair of animals as maybe a 5 or a 4 foot, but it's completely decked out, is really elaborate and three-dimensional space, and there's visual breaks here and there, there's compartments here and there, there's like multiple different options to get away from each other. Whereas in that 6 foot, you go from that side to that side and you're in contact again, rather than all these dynamic environment parts come to play that is actually probably more important than the space. hierarchy in some cases anyway.
Well, that kind of ties in really well with the one of the questions that we got from the patrons is talking about communal hides and making sure that you are utilizing that space properly. And I don't know, maybe Joe, if you had anything on this with the leopard geckos, like when you're creating hides for these animals, are you making sure the hides have space for 2 or all 3 of them, or how are you managing that, or how are you coming up with the size?
Well, it was quite funny because I never a few years ago when I first set up the enclosure, which you can see on my channel, I didn't have any of the side panels. I don't want to call them backgrounds, side grounds. I don't know, but I didn't have those on, and I didn't have the background on. I just had it flat, and I just had it just with me male leopard gecko in it, and he's quite a big lad, so the hides that I had for him were reasonably large anyway, and he can go in and out, and they're all just pieces of cork because I don't really, I suppose it's personal taste, but I don't really like resin hides because, I don't know how many enclosures I've seen with Exoterra medium reptile caves in, and I do not want any of my vivs to be one of them. So I always use like pieces of wood and that. No offense to anybody who's got one of those, by the way. Feel free to do what you like. Ignore me. But basically, I've got like bits of cork, so it's they're sort of open, if you like. Things can go in and through them. And then when I decided I wanted to keep some females with him, and I built the pieces up the sides, that was sort of with the idea in mind that is going to increase the usable space in the enclosure, such that the animals have more opportunity to get away from each other within that 3 by 2 by 2 foot. So, like as Liam says, it's about making sensible use of the enclosure space. When you've got an enclosure, whether you're going to cohabit or not, make as much space, make as much use of the space as you can. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah,
it's not going to take
tank
up any more. Yeah, exactly. The things don't go floating around in there. You put something in it that they can climb on. That's more space. So do it.
Surface
but
area.
That is why I put the background in for him. And with it's coming to a head. This the leopard geckos, when they are hiding, because it's like cork and there's bits that go up and they can go in and out. I do see them say there's a big piece of cork on the right hand side of the enclosure that most nights the male and one of the females, so Speckles and Dotty, go there together of an evening, like clockwork. And then throughout the day, all 3 geckos sit at places that are predictable throughout the day on the background. Pepper, one of the females, sits under the heat lamp on a particular piece of cork bark. Speckles, the male, sits right in the middle at the top. And Dotty, the other female, sits on the right-hand side at the top. They don't hide. They all sit out on the cork bark almost all day long, every day. Occasionally, if I come in and hit the door a bit hard, Pepper's a little bit shy, so she'll run off. But they all sit out together in different places. And occasionally, one will come and sit and rest its head on top of the other. But if I hadn't put that background in and had that space for them to go, I wouldn't see this because they couldn't climb. They would just be in a couple of hides together. And I wouldn't really see very much. So it all comes down to give them a hell of a lot of options and you'll find out what they need.
I think that applies to all, even if you keep them individually, though. It's important to give complex environments. So yeah, I agree with what Liam said. I agree, and I also disagree. I think it would set a dangerous precedent to imply that space isn't important. It is. But you're absolutely right in that visual barriers are needed. In my experience, and this is just my experience, this is particularly important for lizards. If we go back to the example I gave of the masked curly-tailed lizards, the dominant male would spend a lot of its time on the highest point in its enclosure, bobbing, and displaying to its conspicuity. The females would be around it. The smaller male would be much lower down, hidden, and it could get to the basking lamp. It could get to females as long as it was hidden from the male, so it could make use of that. yes, you need a lot of complexity. You need visual barriers to break up the enclosure. You need places to cut, to hide and climb. You need separate hides. But to be honest, this is something I would provide to a single animal as well. So I would, make sure that there are multiple hides throughout the enclosure, at the warm end, at the middle, and then at the cool end. You would have several places to climb. I'm not going to flat out state that you need to double those, but the more the better. You're right. But at the same time, you do need the space, because with lizards, males will chase the smaller one, the smaller male around, or fight. And people might get scared at that. And if you see it happening, you might want to separate them. You don't necessarily need to, as long as there's room for the males to escape. And again, if we're talking a 5 or 6 foot enclosure for a 6-inch lizard, it can be done with space and with visual barriers. So yeah, you're right. And that is something that's very important to bring up. You've got to have multiple of everything. Again, this is something that I personally would associate with any enclosure, because you're giving a single animal choices. Captivity, complexity is all about choice. So for me personally, that's something I would also think was important for a single animal. It just becomes doubly important when you've got multiple animals that may not want to share the same hide. So yeah, you definitely need to put more in there. With snakes, I actually find the opposite. I find that snakes tend to utilize the same hide more often than not, which I think Laurie alluded to earlier. Quite often, I find the snakes both using the same hide. Is it because it's just a more convenient hide, it's warmer, it's the right humidity, it just happens to be located in the right place? It may be, but again, going back to the studies by Morgan Skinner on garter snakes, there seems to be the implication that at least some snakes will follow conspecifics and use the same hide. And if you watch all these field herping videos, or if you go out and lift pieces of tin, you might lift 20 pieces of tin and find nothing. And then under that one last tin, you'll lift it and there'll be 20 or 30 slow worms under it, or several grass snakes or adders. They'll all be in the same place. Is it because it just happens to be in a correct environment for them, that it provides a suitable microhabitat? Or is it that they're attracted to one another? It goes again with hibernacular. A lot of these animals tend to be solitary, as far as we know, throughout much of the year. But during the winter, they all tend to come together. Do they come together solely because the hibernacular is convenient? Are we going to believe that, because if you look at the adders at my local patch that I survey, the adders can move 800 or 900 meters to get from their breeding grounds to the hibernacular. Now, there are plenty of rabbit burrows where other snakes hibernate, and some snakes just circumnavigate those and go to the further ones. Are they doing that out of habit? Are they doing it because they're attracted by certain conspecifics? Or is it just more convenient? We don't know. But it's something to bear in mind that with snakes, I've noticed that they tend to prefer to share the same hides more often than not. I don't know if that's something that anyone else can sort of confirm.
Laurie, did you want to add anything to that as far as the observational data that you have?
Well, I just wanted to add that as far as the space, I don't think you can go too large. These animals live on the planet and they can go anywhere they want in nature. So I don't think that you can go too large, but a large space with no stuff in it is not going to be optimal either. You have to fill that up with environmental complexity and options for these animals to exercise behavioral choices within that space that you're giving them. That's very important. I think you can go too small, but I don't have a number in my head what that would be. Mm-hmm. The other thing I want to point out, because we've talked a lot about agonistic behavior and watching for maladaptive conflict, but conflict isn't necessarily bad. Mm-hmm. Conflict is a good thing, okay? So conflict is going to be natural, and a certain amount of healthy conflict between these conspecifics is going to be healthy. It's going to drive growth and learning and progression, and it's going to build resilience in these animals. What we as keepers need to watch for is when that conflict tips over a certain point and it becomes maladaptive, and now you have animals that are injuring each other, not eating, becoming ill, and it's our job to monitor that and know what is a healthy amount of conflict and what is good for the animal to build resiliency, and what now is a dangerous amount of conflict, and then remove the animals or separate them or whatever you need to do.
Yeah, that's a really, and that was actually one of the questions that we had as well is, obviously you have animals together, there's going to be a hierarchy must be established. And the only way that can be established is through a pecking order. If anyone has chickens, you know exactly what that looks like. You can't stop that from happening because then it sort of ruins the process of building that hierarchy, but you also need to be in tune with it. And as soon as, one animal is getting bullied and becoming anorexic or whatever it is, that's when, as the keeper, you really need to pull back. Francis, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and that's something that ties into just observation. Mm-hmm. It's an observational skill. You need to know the animals to identify where that tipping point is and what that behavior, where that occurs and when it's time to move them. That's not something a beginner keeper necessarily will have.
Yeah.
If you've just started keeping these animals, you might not know these animals' behaviors well enough to identify where to stand, which is why I'm not sold on the idea of amateur keepers keeping together with not all species, but many species, until they have a certain amount of experience with the species individually. Going to what Laurie said, you're exactly right with the positive conflict. A good example that I have are some of the rat snakes I keep, like ladder snakes and Japanese rat snakes. They will wrestle. The males will wrestle. I still keep the males together, but during spring, you'll notice them actually wrestling and they'll be doing this kind of weird serpentine dance. Whether it is a combat behavior or whether it's territorial, or whether it is just for dominance, to make a hierarchy or over a female that they can smell in the next cage, I don't know. But it certainly seems to increase breeding behavior to the point that a lot of carpet python keepers, again, they will use this kind of idea of conflict to stimulate breeding. Now, with pythons, not all, but some pythons can be much more aggressive and injure one another. I mean, reticulated python males can deliver horrific slashing injuries to other pythons. So I would certainly not really, for my sake as a keeper, I would personally not cohabit giant snakes out of a safety. Because if two Japanese rat snakes, one bites the other one, nothing's going to happen. They'll barely even penetrate the scales. If a retic bites another retic, then they can open up a massive wound. And then on top of that, if you're feeding a giant, a reticulated python or an anaconda, it's dangerous enough with one. If you've got a second one, that's two possibly dangerous animals that you're dealing with. So for me personally, in a private setting, I wouldn't house or cohabit giant snakes. However, it can be done. That's not saying that it can't be done. It's just that I personally wouldn't. But with smaller snakes, Japanese rat snakes, I'll let them wrestle. Carpet pythons, I do digress a lot. So with carpet python keeping, what many people will do instead of introducing a male to another male, because they can fight and bite one another, is they'll actually get the shed skin of one male and put it into the enclosure of the other. And that will quite often stimulate breeding just as a sense of competition, perhaps. But it's one of those little tricks that a lot of people use to try and get a male snake in the mood for reproduction. Mm-hmm. But certainly you can see wrestling type behaviors with a lot of snakes that I don't even think has been documented in. Philodryas baroni is another one that I've seen do this, where they will actually sort of do this wrestling, and there's two males, and it looks somewhat similar to mating, but it isn't. It's actually a wrestling. So it's always quite an interesting thing to observe.
So what about, so I'm going to set a theoretical situation. Imagine that, some research came out, or, people were keeping crested geckos together and it showed there was a benefit there. We're just going to use that as an example because I have one that's been by himself for 15 years. So let's just say now I'm like, okay, I want to cohab this animal. Does that make sense for this individual? This is somebody who spent his entire existence alone and maybe missed out on some of those early social learning that might require him to benefit being in a social environment. I don't know we're kind of speculating here. There might be some research, but that could end up in a dramatically stressful situation forever for him. He may never get used to that. So I don't know. Does anyone have any? Laura, did you want to jump on that first, and then you go ahead?
If I wanted to do something like that, I would set it up where that animal remained in his own enclosure, and I built a pass-through into a second enclosure that had other conspecifics in it. Then the animals have choice. You always want to make sure that the animals have choice and control over their own behavioral options. So I wouldn't just throw a second one in there with your existing one. I would leave him exactly how he is, but give him the opportunity to interact with conspecifics, but also not take away the ability for him to retreat back to his home range, his home habitat. And so when I talk about these pass-throughs, you have to have more than one, because you don't want an animal to block the pass-through if another animal wants through it. So you have to have them spread apart, and you have to have more than one.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I mean, crested geckos might not be the best example. I know of a lot more examples of crested geckos fighting than, for example, with leopard geckos. I actually cohabit a pair of crested geckos in a 3 foot by 3 foot enclosure. So that's a 3 foot tall, 3 foot wide, which is, it's not huge, but it's bigger than many give. And it's what I would consider a minimum for one personally. I mean, people will keep them smaller than that, but that amount of height, I believe, is important. And I don't notice any agonistic behavior. I have seen agonistic behavior in crested geckos. I don't know enough about them to know whether or not they are social. So I would personally be very careful about introducing, especially an animal that's been alone as long as yours had, simply because I am aware of other examples where if they're kept individually for the first few years, yes, they may be less adaptable to cohabitation later. I mean, I don't actually personally keep monitors myself, but I have many monitor keepers among my friends, and I read some of what they've written with interest. So, for example, even in Aki monitors, there seems to be an unwritten rule that you grow a group up together if you want to select a breeding pair, and then as they get older, you pair them from within that group. Because otherwise there may be problems actually getting even a male and a female to mix if they're older and they're not accustomed to one another. As I said, this isn't something I've personally experienced, but I've read enough people say it that it is something that has stuck in my memory. And we've noticed similar issues with other aspects of reptile biology. For example, hibernation. Animals that have not been hibernated in their first year or first or second year apparently are less able to withstand hibernation when put outdoors after that. In the same way, it might be true that animals that are raised individually may be less amenable to cohabiting. But again, there's no hard and fast rule, and that's the real issue with this whole discussion. There's no one-size-fits-all rule for anything. You can only try for yourself and see what happens. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, be prepared to separate them quickly and make sure that you are very observant over the first few days and weeks that you cohab them. And do what Laurie said, either keep the animal in with a passage into its own enclosure, or I would suggest put them both into an entirely new enclosure so that one hasn't already staked a claim over a territory that it's familiar with. That might be stressful on its own though, for the animal that's lived for 15 years in its own enclosure. So again, it's one of those things where knowing the animal's behavior, knowing what it normally does, you would get a feel for what it's thinking, so to speak, and whether or not things are going well, and you'd be able to separate based on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So there may go ahead, Laurie.
Well, Dylan, there are other options other than what I said.
Before you go too far, I was just going to say, before you go too far, like this is not something that I'm necessarily going to do. It was more,
okay.
Just talk. I mean, I'll let you finish that point, but it's more so pointing out the fact that there may be a key to that early socialization that plays a role in whether or not that can be successful in the future. But I'll let you finish because I'm sure somebody's wondering what you're going to say there.
Well, I just say that there are other options, and I have tried these other options where you've taken two glass terrariums and set them side by side with the animals in so they can see each other, but they're not in contact with each other. And then, I have exercise and enrichment areas set up that are safe for the animals to come out of their own habitats and use. So you can let those animals interact in those enrichment areas together for short periods of time. Then they go back to their own habitats. They see each other through the glass. They interact in the enrichment areas together. So they're slowly becoming accustomed to each other. And then you could try putting them together at some point. And I've done that very successfully as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great point. I want to take us in a slightly different direction here. I can't believe it's already 3:50 my time. It's just we're just blazing through the time here. And like Francis said, this is just an unlimited topic, I think. I want to touch a little bit on heterospecific keeping. So I kind of have a two-part question. To do that, to keep two different species in the same environment, in the same enclosure, should they be a biotype setup? And by that I mean, are we trying to pull animals from the exact same native habitat to have success? So that's the first part. And then the second part is, should you try to pick animals that occupy different ecological niche so they're not competing over the same resources within the enclosure, or is it okay to have them overlapping? Again, welcome to a broad question that probably has essays worth of answers. But I know, Joe, you're just starting to experiment with this. So maybe you want to jump onto that, and then we'll kind of rip around the table.
Well, the thing that the mixed species enclosure that I've got at the minute is I've got me poison dart frogs, Dendrobates tinctorius robertus, in the same little enclosure at the moment as I am raising my hatchling line day geckos in. I've kept the frogs separate from the adults. The adult lizards at the minute, because I'm going to be growing on the hatchling day geckos for like another half a year anyway. So, if there's anything wrong with the frogs, then the hatchling day geckos can be in quarantine with them, is the way I'm thinking of it. But the frogs and geckos actually don't interact at all. Mm-hmm. Haven't seen any interaction between them. It's not like the frogs don't climb or anything. They do go right up to the top of the enclosure occasionally. They just don't interact whatsoever. The day geckos are most active when it's really bright, when all of the lamps are on, and they're running around at the top of the enclosure all the time. Whereas the frogs tend only to become active in the sort of morning and evening parts of the lighting cycle. So when the UV lamp is off, which is really quite interesting, and they tend to stay at the bottom of the enclosure. So it's like there's two different species in this enclosure and they don't interact. Mm-hmm. I've not seen them cross paths at all. And then that is just in a 50 centimetre tall enclosure as well. And it's only 40 centimetres across and 40 centimetres front to back. So when I eventually move those frogs in with the adults, it's, that's 3 feet tall and 3 feet across. I doubt they're ever going to even lock eyes. Mm-hmm. So with that being said, I think if you're going to try mixing species and you're doing it in such a way where the animals are like both as separate as those, the day geckos and the frogs, then I can't really see you having much of a problem. Obviously, if I were to try and keep the dart frogs with giant day geckos, then the giant day geckos would see them and then it would be dinner time, and that wouldn't be quite so fun. But with the little day geckos I've got, there's not really very much that could go wrong there. But on that topic, there are things where I've thought about it, and having completely separated things might actually be worse. So, for instance, let's say that you've got a diurnal species which is very active, searching things. So possibly lacertas or something like that, or a bigger lacerta maybe, or an agamid, which goes charging around all day, going over everything, making loads of noise. And then you have a nocturnal species, which is asleep and likes to sleep out in the open, say curled up on a branch or something. Well, that diurnal species charging around is going to be walking all on top of it and getting up in its space, and vice versa when it's at the night time and the diurnal species is wrapped up on its log. And then that nocturnal creature goes running around and climbing all over it. It's just going to be an irritant, really. So there's sort of a fine line to tread there between what's good separation and what's too separate.
Yeah.
I mean, I've even noticed that from my king snakes and the millipedes. I said it to Francis the other day, where they were in the basking spot. The snake was curled up in the basking spot basking, and this millipede comes down this branch and it starts like walking on top of the king snake, and the king snake flicks its tail at the millipede to get it off of it, and then the millipede obviously turns around and comes back again, and it did like 3 or 4 times where the king snake would flick its tail slightly and it'd be progressively more aggressive with the flick. Until one point, it actually flicks the millipede quite a distance away, and then the millipede comes back again until the king snake finally just leaves the basking spot because it just didn't want to be walked over. Now, that millipede actually forced the king snake to stop basking, which is what that king snake had chosen to do. So in actuality, I know this is talking about bioactivity isn't really cohabiting, but it kind of is. You're kind of cohabiting your vertebrate with invertebrates that are actually maybe an irritant to the animal, like Joe said.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It is one of the reasons I am less than keen with bioactive for many snakes, especially terrestrial snakes. And I've gone on record because I've seen exactly the same behavior that you've just described. The snakes just seem to exhibit discomfort. They exhibit the same sort of behaviors that they do when, for example, a female mite, when a male keeps trying to rub against her to mate and she's not receptive, that sort of, twitchy behavior that they exhibit. I see exactly the same thing. And when you see some of the bioactive enclosures, I'm not ragging on bioactivity. I keep some bioactive enclosures. I think it can be a great method of keeping. I just think that often it's not great with snakes. Especially you see some of these enclosures that literally the floor is a carpet of springtails, for example, that's just like moving. And people will boast about how a leftover mouse or a shed skin will disappear overnight. I was like, does that sound very comfortable for the snake to live on? When you can actually see these sort of twitching behaviors, I'd argue not. So personally, I'm not really for that kind of thing. I like naturalistic enclosures. I think that frogs and lizards, certain types, can be kept on bioactive. But I've noticed exactly the same thing that you've just described more than once. It more than enough to convince me that it's not necessarily comfortable for the snake. Is it bad that the snake had to move? Well, I mean, in the wild, it might move if a bird flew over it or if somebody walked past and then come out again. But this is captivity, not the wild. So you want it to at least feel some sort of comfort. And if you've got a millipede that's constantly walking over this thing, especially in a small enclosure, I don't think that that's necessarily a great thing personally. So it does steer me away towards bioactive of that kind. But again, we digress a little bit.
And Francis, do you have any opinions on the biotype concept or the occupying separate? Okay.
This is really the meat and potatoes of the discussion because it's one thing.
It took us 2 hours to get here.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about the same species kept together. It's easy to justify the same species kept together because there are aspects that we discussed. There's lots of types of social behavior. Different species, that might be harder. But then again, you look at aquaria, for example. It's so ingrained that you have community aquaria. You've got angelfish with tetras and little catfish, and you mix all of these species, despite the fact that angelfish can bully tetras and barbs can, bully angelfish and nip their fins. And you've got all these little rules, like you've got to have more than 3 tiger barbs or they'll bully other fish. People have been doing it for generations with fish, but somehow everyone is insistent that it's terrible for reptiles. I think that even if there are no benefits, but I will get to a couple of benefits I can think of in a moment, but even if there were no benefits other than to the keeper, well, it looks nice. If people are so eager to justify minimalist keeping because it's keeper-centric, then I can also justify cohabiting animals in a great big planted terrarium because it's keeper-centric for me, because I enjoy seeing it together. As long as the animals don't harm one another, there's no problem. With the biotope, I agree and I disagree. What you've got to remember is that in the confines of a terrarium, however dedicated you are not going to have a true biotope unless you're putting the correct type of soil, the pH, the same plants. It's not going to be a slice of an exact habitat. The good thing about mixing animals that occur together is that you know that they occur together and therefore are subject to the same climatic and habitat conditions. So, for example, common lizards and slow worms often can be found together. I've kept them together and they do very well. However, it's not just as simple as that. Samodromus algirus, it doesn't really have an English common name, large Samodromus, let's say, which is a nice lizard that you find in Iberia, with spiny-footed lizards. They occur in roughly the same kind of area. The spiny-footed lizards occur in more open terrain and sand and like less vegetated places. The Samodromus more in the shade, but you can find them in the same essential habitat, but different microhabitats. If you mix those, the spiny-footed lizards, despite being around the same size, will bully the hell out of the Amazromus. And I discovered this myself as a kid. You can't mix spiny-footed lizards with other lizards because they bully them. You can mix Amazromus with wall lizards and geckos, though. Those get along, even though the geckos live up walls, not necessarily in the same habitat. So just because they occur in the same habitat doesn't mean that they'll get along. There's also the problem of size. Leopard geckos, like one of the main aspects of their diet is smaller lizards. You don't want to mix a leopard gecko with a smaller lizard because it'll probably eat it. However, and the same goes for many skinks as well, by the way. So skinks, unless the other lizard is larger than a skink, skinks tend to be so voracious that they tend to eat smaller lizards up to and including almost the same size, which is, it can be impressive how much something like a mabuya or a trachylepis, one of the Asian or African skinks, or a five-line skink will be able to take. They will eat smaller lizards. Whereas, for example, if you choose a green anole from America and a long-tailed skink from Southeast Asia, can you keep those together? Yeah, you can. The reason that you can is that they're so hardy, and you could put house geckos in for good measure, and they all live in different habitats and different places, but they're so hardy that they can, as long as the terrarium is large enough and offers enough of a range of conditions, again, it all comes down to choices, then yeah, they'll cohabit just fine. If you mixed, a boa constrictor with a Burmese python, could they cohabit? Yeah, they could. It's as simple as that. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily, but in terms of habitat needs, they're both easy and hardy snakes to keep. They don't, if people can keep them in a small box with newspaper and they'll survive that, then they'll certainly survive a more elaborate setup, in similar conditions. Many of these reptiles are very hardy. Burmese pythons survive in the Everglades. The Everglades, you can get Burmese pythons living in the same sort of area as giant day geckos, which Joseph mentioned. They're both in Florida. I think Tom Crutchfield has mentioned he's got African agamas in his garden. He's got giant day geckos in his garden, and they're all on the outside of his Burmese and reticulated python enclosures. So they certainly can exist in the same place. Mm-hmm. Do they cohabit inside a viv? It varies from species to species, but I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that it's only feasible to cohabit animals from the same area. There's always going to be exceptions. Many of the animals that do best in a cohabited viv tend to be hardy anyway. So, house geckos and Moorish geckos, you get them all over the world. They've spread out, and now they live in docksides and buildings literally on every continent except Antarctica. So they can certainly adapt to the confines of a terrarium. I would say that the biggest benefit, there are two benefits I can think of mixing species. The first is if you are doing an elaborate terrarium, it's going to be bigger and more elaborate by necessity. That's a good thing. It's as simple as that. You're more likely to put the effort into making a large planted, if it's a biotope, then it may be a biotope, but a large naturalistic terrarium that's designed for more than one species is more likely by necessity to be more complex of an environment. And that can be a good thing. As long as the species don't kill each other or don't fight each other and they get along fairly well, then that's good. So it gives people the incentive to do better. That's one benefit. The second benefit applies to me quite specifically. I'd always grown up catching animals. Again, I'm not going to justify this. This is the 80s or 90s. I'm not going to sort of sensationalize it. I'm not going to make it out for any more or less than what it was. But I used to keep Moorish geckos and Turkish geckos that I used to catch with wall lizards and green lizards and Amazromus and small skinks. Now, when I designed a terrarium for my wall lizards, I knew that they needed high-intensity lighting. They needed full-spectrum white light, UV, because they're lacertids. They have pineal eyes. That means that light intensity governs their activity. Without that light intensity, they won't be as active. You wouldn't necessarily think the same for a nocturnal gecko, but because I was cohabiting these geckos with the lacertids, you start noticing that the geckos are actually coming out and making use of the UV that I put in for the lacertids. This is, we're talking like middle of the 90s, the very earliest UV types of bulbs, the Groluxes and the Zoomeds and so on, the Reptiglows. The geckos were coming out and making use of that light. And that was the first lightning bolt that hit me saying, oh, okay, so even these so-called nocturnal animals will come out and bask. I mean, I've seen it enough in the wild, but even in captivity, it's happening. So if you provide it for one, then the others will make use of it.
That
When
makes
it comes
me. Oh, sorry, I thought you stopped.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
go on.
Probably more important what I was going to say anyway.
Go on.
Yeah, go ahead, Liam, make that point.
Yeah.
I was going to say, because you said about how that crepuscular or nocturnal species was using that high intensity light, it makes me wonder how beneficial it would be to provide these crepuscular snakes and stuff with these Dasku spotlights, things like that.
Oh, don't get me started on
Well,
lighting, Liam.
that's going to literally diverge. It is. I provide.
Lori's
you can
just
see
shaking her
behind
head.
me. All I've got in this room are snakes, and they are all lit with UV, with white light, and with halogen heating, and they all utilize it no matter how nocturnal they're said to be.
Mm-hmm.
If I look back now, I will be able to spot snakes basking in every vid that I can see. So yeah, they will use it. When it comes to cohabiting, because if we diverge too much from that, I think we could rant on for hours. When I set up, for me personally, I like, because I'm quite a late nighter, I used to like having something active in the vids at all hours. So I would specifically mix a diurnal lacertid with a crepuscular, I'm not going to say nocturnal, but a crepuscular gecko that would be active at night. So I could watch them at night, if I was up typing or whatever. And I would often mix in a semi-fossorial species. So, for example, in Spain, we get a species called Bedriagus skink, which is not in the hobby as of now. I don't think it's ever been kept other than, if you catch it. Legally, I think it's protected now since the 80s or 90s. But when I was a kid, I used to catch those, and three-toed skinks. So you'd have these little sort of burrowing lizards moving around in the in the substrate and the leaf litter. You'd have wall lizards or lacertids sort of rushing around in the midsection, and then you'd have the geckos sort of sitting on the walls or underneath stones. And it was interesting because, you could mix them and have something on every tier of the enclosure.
Like a fish tank.
So you can. There's certainly something to be said for utilizing all the space with different animals. I think a good example, I may provide some photos for Dylan if you want to add them in at some point. I mean, this YouTube video is going to be 3 hours long by the time we finish. But for example, I keep a species called the Western green lizard, Lacerta bilineata. And I know a lot of the viewers will be American, so they might not know this species, but it's basically a very bright emerald green lizard that's about 1 foot long. And I cohabitate them with a smaller lizard, which is the common wall lizard, Podacus moralis, which anyone in Europe will be familiar with. But again, I think there are some invasive ones in America, so it might be a species that you know too.
Of course there is.
Now, you would think that the green lizards might eat the wall lizards, which is what I was scared of, because they are substantially larger. But actually, I used to observe them, and they in the wild, you can see them literally basking on the wall lizards will bask on top of the green lizards. They'll bask next to one another. So I mixed them, and actually, what I found is that aggression is another important factor to consider in cohabitation. Podacus are extremely, and when I say aggressive, I'm not going to say that they're attacking the green lizard, but they are aggressive eaters. They are non-stop movers. They are not shy. I'll put it like that. They're not shy animals, to the point that I've actually seen them steal food from the green lizard's mouth, which, I mean, in the wild, I can fully understand that this smaller but much less shy species would probably push out green lizards, and they've said to have done the same with sand lizards in parts of the UK where they're also invasive, because they're just simply more ferocious eaters. If it wasn't in captivity and I was not able to actually just hand feed these lizards, it would be a mess. But this is a case where a smaller lizard that you'd expect the larger lizard to bully actually wins out, and they do really well with the sort of more sedate green lizards. Another good genus.
Basically Chihuahuas and Great Danes.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I mean, another good genus to mix is Cordylus, girdle lizards. So obviously you've got the famous ones, which are the armadillo lizard and the which is now Ouroboros, not Cordylus, but they were Cordylus. And you've also got sun gazers, which again are Smaug now. They used to be Cordylus. But you've also got a whole host of other girdle lizards from Africa, which nowadays they're very rarely kept. I think it's because Southern Africa doesn't export much anymore. But there's one species, which is the tropical girdle lizard, Cordylus tropidosternum. And because they're so tough and armored, and they happen to be a social species anyway, they live in groups. That's one species I would actually say it's worth to keep alone rather than in groups. But you can keep them with other lizards. For example, the more aggressive African skinks, such as Trachylepis, which are around the same size but more voracious, because they're armored and there's no way that a skink could bother one. That's a pairing that I've done very well as well.
Yeah, no, that's no. I think this is great. I think it's good because we're laying out A, how complicated this matter is. It's not simple, and B, you don't want to paint this topic as a cookie cutter. These are the steps you have to follow, because the keeper really, really needs to be engaged in this process. And in a lot of ways, it's better just to give it's somewhat vague information to force keepers to go down the path of research and natural history and understanding what it is they're trying to do. There's a few other things that I wanted to ask about, and maybe Laura, you could start with this because you were keeping the snakes. Is feeding, because that's an issue with the lizards. We already talked about. Tong feeding can help you out to make sure that the right animals are eating, but feeding. I mean, I know Ken and Harkin had this video was it last year, where he has two carpet pythons together, and inevitably you have a snake constricting another snake, and it's a horrible situation. And so how do we avoid that? And what are some tips for people to feed?
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that because I've done it obviously with 10 different pairs of snakes. But before that, I just wanted to mention for anyone that's looking at cohabitating multiple species, zoos do it all the time. Multi-species exhibits are very popular in zoological facilities because they're so interesting to see. And in some cases, they mimic the natural habitat that all these animals would coexist in nature. That information about which species successfully can mix together is available. It's readily available. If you just do a Google Scholar search, or you search the AZA or AZAC or the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, they have care manuals. They have specific manuals for which species can be in mixed exhibits together. So there's really one, if you decide you want to do that, it's more work. It's going to be more work to do that than not. So I sometimes feel people think they're going to do it because it'll be easier. Oh, I'll just throw all these animals in one enclosure and that will be easier. It is not easier. It's more challenging. But the information is readily available. So this is one area where there's no excuse not to do the research first, because you can find it with just a few keystrokes. And then to your question about feeding animals that are cohabitated, I always separate them to feed, which, if your animals are comfortable and relaxed with you going in and removing them, fine. If they know how to use a shift box, fine. I tend to train mine to different targets. So like the inland carpet pythons, one is trained to follow a royal blue target and the other one is trained to follow a green target. And so each one will follow their own target to where I want them to station, and then I feed them. But again, that's another aspect of cohabitation that's more complicated. If you're not cohabitating species that eat communally, like I understand garter snakes can be fed communally, like in a pond or on dishes, and you spread them around the enclosure and they're going to eat and there's not going to be any fighting. But you can't do that with like I have so many carpet pythons. You can't do that with carpet pythons. One will inevitably, even if you feed them in both halves of the enclosure, one's going to finish sooner than the other, and the other one's going to go over and try to grab the rodent from the other. And then you end up with, even if it's inadvertent, even if the other snake didn't purposefully bite the second snake, it's going to happen because of miscommunication during feeding. So I always separate. And how you do that is up to you. You can take one out and leave one in. You can take them both out. You can put them in separate shifts. I train mine to come out into separate areas, but I do not recommend feeding snakes together in the same space.
Mm-hmm. And what about yourself, Francis? What do you do?
I agree with that in principle. Yeah, I mean, it varies from snake to snake. For example, Japanese rat snakes, Philodryas baroni, Thrasops, horrendously voracious feeders. I mean, they will literally launch themselves out of their viv at you to get food. And once they've gobbled that down, they will look for more. And if none is forthcoming, if the other snake is eating with them, then they will start trying to take it off the other snake. So yes, most of the commonly kept pet snakes, other than garter snakes, as Laurie mentioned, separate them. And not only separate them, I would also leave them apart for about an hour afterwards for the scent to come off. Because the thing is, if you reintroduce, say you feed 2 Japanese rat snakes, they swallow their food down. They're still in feeding mode because I don't always feed them the same amount of food. This is I feed them, sometimes I'll feed multiple smaller items, or different types of food. So they won't necessarily come straight out of feeding mode after one portion of food. They'll be looking around the viv for more. So I will let them stay separate for some time after. Generally, it's about as long as I'm feeding the rest of the collection, to be honest, but at least an hour or so before reintroducing them. And even then, there can be miscommunication. Even then, I've had, Japanese rat snakes in particular are just the worst, that they will sort of smell and take a bite. But even then, a lot of people would consider that a horrific thing. Oh, you can't cohabitate because it bit. Normally what will happen is it'll bite and it'll sort of hold on for a while. It might try to, and then it'll let go and nothing else will happen. If it's still in feeding mode, then it can be worse because they'll bite and start trying to constrict one another. One can carry on eating and you can have a tragedy. So yes, generally separate snakes. With some snakes, it's not. I don't. So for example, my tiger rat snakes, I don't separate, but those I know only tongue feed. They will only strike feed. They know, they will react to me strike feeding. Coach whips won't fight, surprisingly enough. I thought that they would, but no, they're actually perfectly safe to feed together in my experience. Again, everything I'm saying is in my experience. Tomorrow, somebody might do things exactly the way I do and have a mishap. So this, I can only say without a disclaimer, this is what I have sort of learned over several decades. But for example, coach whips will take food off tongues, they'll eat it, and then they'll leave each other alone. Philadrias and Japanese rat snakes won't. So to be safe, I would separate. One example that sticks out more than most was a species called Dendrolaphis pictus, which was a type of bronzeback from Southeast Asia. They are very shy snakes, and I used to just put a pile of pinkies and fish in with them. And I had 6 in the enclosure, and it was just such a comedic thing. You'd see all 6 of them come out and start eating gently. And like garters, they would eat and swallow, but they would not touch one another. So again, that was a specific example. But to be safe until you are fully sure that the snakes are not sort of that kind of rapacious of mind that they'll attack anything that moves, it is definitely safer to separate snakes out when feeding. Lizards, not so much. Lizards and frogs, you can't. If you're putting live food, especially, you can't really separate that out unless you're tongue feeding them individually, which I prefer to feed live. I will moderate, if I see one isn't eating as much as the others, I'll make sure to moderate it, but that's just something that is a benefit of captivity. But with snakes, I would definitely agree. Separation during feeding it should be the done thing. There may be exceptions, but certainly to begin with, you should have a view to separating out during feeding and leaving them apart. So don't just put one on the floor and let it, make sure you've got a box to put it in, which raises its own issues of biosecurity, because you don't want to be you're sort of mixing snakes from different enclosures in the same box. So yeah, it is a complicated discussion. And as we keep saying, there are more reasons not to do it than to do it. But if you do it and you do decide to go that way, it can be very rewarding and show behaviors that you wouldn't necessarily see otherwise. So that, for me, is its own reward.
Yeah. So I think that's great. I think that's a really good point to make. And again, complicated, but worth it as long as you've done the research. And I think we'll kind of start wrapping up because we're going to hit the 2.5 hour mark. And it's I know we could keep going. It looks like Joe has something to say here. But I also am going to make you say something as well, Joe. Can you quickly just lay out the short experiment you had with your Chinese leopard snakes? What did you see that you weren't liking? That, for those of you that don't know, Joe tried to cohab these 2 snakes, and then he only did it for a couple of weeks and then decided against it. So maybe you could just quickly run through that story. Yeah,
that actually ties in pretty nicely with what I wanted to say anyway, actually. Perfect. So I'll say that and then move on to it. What I did is I put the male Chinese leopard snake, twin spot rat snake, Elaphia bimaculata, whatever you want to call it. I put the male in with the female with the idea that I could transition the female leopard geckos out of the quarantine enclosure into the spare previous snake enclosure, because that's out in the outdoor reptile room so they could get cold inside the vivarium of the winter and hence hibernate. And then once they'd hibernated, I would put them in with the male leopard gecko. So it's sort of a bit of a gentler transition, and it gave the females another extra couple of months just to like develop a bit more before I put them in with the male. That was the thinking. So I thought I'll try these snakes together. And if they do all right together, then I'll be all right going ahead with this, and it'll be just more gentle with the leopard geckos, and if the snakes are getting on, okay. But obviously I didn't move the snake and then put the leopard geckos in the snake enclosure straight away, because if I were to do that and the snakes did need separating, then I was going to be snookered, wasn't I? So I put the male Chinese leopard snake in with the female, and they were doing all right. They were feeding straight away. They were pretty active. But then after the first introduction, they were whizzing round after each other for like an hour. And then they calmed down, and I thought, oh, well, they're calm now. They just got used to each other. That'll be okay. Next day, a little bit of activity, yeah. Next day after that, not much of them. Next day after that, just going round and round, and it continued. A couple of days of calm. Fed them, they both ate together just fine, not off food. But after sort of getting on for a fortnight, the activity of the male constantly going around after the female, I was thinking, I was talking to Francis about it, and he was giving me tips from the master of brown snakes. And I just sort of, this long term over the whole winter, this wasn't going to be right. So I separated them out again, and then just put the female leopard geckos in with the male and tried that to see how it worked. And actually, I should have just done that from the get-go, because they're just perfectly fine with each other. But that was that. Now, that leads on to what I was going to say is, you talked about, or just mentioned Camp Kennan with the carpet pythons the other week, or month or whatever. Colin and Peter, the carpet pythons. One went for each other, and one went for the other during feeding. Because I watched that video, because Camp Kennan's all right. So shout out to Camp Kennan. But basically what I wanted to say there is, lots of people, not just Camp Kennan, loads of people on the internet keep things together, which not thinking about that particular case, but in general, they keep things together, which I wouldn't necessarily. Like, you see lots and lots of people keeping, for example, now I'm not experienced with these, so I'm just going to put it out there with the opinion I've gathered from what I've seen. People keep rock iguanas together, so like Cyclora nubula and Cyclora lewisi hybrids, and they keep them together, but then tell all these horror stories about, oh, wow, look at this one, how it's taken the leg off this one. Oh, I had to separate these because it's removed all the fingers from its partner. Oh, this one was death roll in the other. Wow, it's amazing that herbivorous reptiles will death roll. And then people just watch it and don't say anything. But I make a video of my leopard geckos together that are just sitting there asleep, and I get bashed for putting them together. It's like, there's like this major folklore idea that you can fit into the cult if you keep these together. But if you keep these together, you are the damned. It's one rule for one and not for the other, which makes me think that this doesn't come from people sitting down and thinking about whether cohabiting is good or not. It comes from people following or spouting the same information that they've just heard elsewhere. And with that leads into a slightly different point, which is that if you are going to cohab, I think you can take tips from other people, but I don't think cohabbing is one of those things that you can learn from other people. It's not like lighting, where you can sit down and if it was all written out in a book, you could get everything. Well, in fact, no, lighting's a bad example because it's too complicated. But say other things, you can learn a method and get it down. Maybe hibernation's a bit of a better example. You can learn, oh, I do this, I do that, and it'll all work out pretty much. I don't think cohabbing is one of those things. It's one of those where you need to get, as Francis has said, you need to get that experience keeping things alone first, ideally for years. Learn what it is that, start to recognize what is normal behavior, what isn't. And then take the tips from other people, but don't just parrot them and see somebody else doing something and assume that's acceptable. And when somebody tells you you can't do this, that you definitely can't, and get all upset about it when you see it. This is a thing that you need to, it's a practical thing. Like, I don't want to call it a skill, but it's heading that way, where it's a thing you have a feel for. You can't learn it by the book.
Mm-hmm.
It's an art, not a science.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. This is the art of keeping, and that's exactly where, there's always going to be that dichotomy between science and art in almost every field of everything you do, and this is where that finesse of a keeper comes in. So let's start wrapping up here. Maybe I'll just give, if Joe, if you're okay with that being your closing words, maybe I'll go to Liam. Do you have anything else you want to add to this topic that you felt we kind of left unsaid?
Yeah, but you said you're going to wrap up, so I'm probably going to start a whole long thing.
Is it a can of worms?
It might be.
Well,
say it and we can argue in the comments.
Well, you can. If it's too long, you can just edit it out. So, my university cohabits bearded dragons. Now, it has one male, two females, and bear in mind this enclosure is massive. But the point, I started this thread ages ago on AHH, but we talk about we should be having natural behaviours all the time, be allowing them to express these natural behaviours. Well, like Laurie mentioned earlier, the bearded dragons learning socially from each other. This is a species that does interact in the wild because it has those behaviours that are able to learn socially from each other. But in captivity, we aren't allowing that. And that's obviously partly due to because we keep them in such small enclosures typically in the hobby. But like Francis, you breed some of the things that you cohab every year. I mean, you might freeze the eggs or feed off the eggs, but they are allowed to mate.
I would never freeze eggs, so it's too wasteful.
But
there's so many animals that would eat them.
That's what I would do as well. But mating, and you got to think that's entirely part of their natural behaviour that they're driven so aggressively to do. It's part of their entire existence is getting to the point where to reproduce. So if you have an individual that never ever gets to experience that, then isn't that an entire part of their behavioral repertoire that's just been taken away from them? And I'm not saying that you need to be pumping out animals all the time, but I'm saying that should we be keeping pairs that allow these natural behaviors, even if you aren't allowing the offspring to be hatched every year? Now there's a part of that where you think, okay, well, you don't want the same female to be producing eggs every year, you want to give them a break. But if you've got like my bearded dragon that like produces infertile eggs every year anyway, and that's just going to produce eggs every year anyway, then if I could provide the massive enclosure like my university does, then would that not actually be beneficial to allow that entire behavioral repertoire around, mating and reproduction and all the social cues that go with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is when we talk about natural behavior all the time, that is a huge part of natural behavior. And I think that Francis and I actually discussed that, I think, on the podcast that we did together. So it's definitely something to chew on for sure. Laurie, did you have any closing words or thoughts?
I'll just let my comment about the cohabitating pairs be my closing thoughts, because I think I've expressed everything I wanted to make sure that we brought up. I have an adult pair of carpet pythons that's cohabitated. Even since before they came to live here with me, they were together already. And I don't know their age or their subspecies. They're likely Darwin's, but I don't know that for sure. But every other year, the female produces eggs. And, I've questioned whether I should be allowing that or not. And I don't want to make babies, so I pull the eggs. But it is part of their natural behavior. They're in an extremely large exhibit type enclosure. And she's not reproducing every year. She's reproducing every other year. So I would presume that they are self-regulating that behavior, that she's taking care of herself. And I don't notice any behavior between the two of them that I would think is unhealthy or unusual. Part of the year, they're together all the time. Part of the year, they're not really together. When she's produced eggs and been sitting on eggs, the male guards the nest, but he doesn't bother her or go into the nest at all. And I don't know. It's an interesting question that you asked, Dylan, and that Liam brings up. Should we be allowing that reproductive behavior under captive management? I don't put animals together that are living separately just so that they can breed naturally, but the ones that are already cohabitating, I'm not trying to interfere with that behavior, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Yeah, definitely. It's another thread to go down, a rabbit hole for sure.
Yeah.
And then, Francis, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to add?
Of course I do.
I shouldn't even have phrased it as a
I've taken
question.
a couple of notes. I apologize. I'm going to go off on another soliloquy. I'll try and be quick because I know you're trying to wrap up. So with Joseph's Elaphid bimaculata, I mean, what he saw there was the one male pursuing the female nonstop, and the female showing a very obvious behavior of twitching. You know, she was not receptive. Now, eventually, that will stop and the male will mate with her. But until then, the male can stress that one female out. It doesn't always happen. I keep a pair of bimaculata together and they're fine. I keep another pair where I keep the male separate from the female because the male is a bit too rambunctious for the female.
Mhm.
So even within a species, different individuals can have a different personality. You will see that across a lot of snakes, though. So I actually personally am not keen with colubrids. With pythons and boas, it's a different matter, but with colubrids, I'm not keen on a one male, one female pairing. With most colubrids, I prefer one male and several females to spread out the male's attention between females, only in a very large enclosure, so much larger, so the female has scope to get away. And I actually prefer two females or even two males occasionally to a single male and female pairing. But again, that will vary. With pythons and boas, it's different. I keep a pair of Amazon tree boas together, and they definitely display some sort of sociality because they are always together. And as Laurie says, the female regulates her breeding. They breed every 2 years. So there's not overbreeding. Whereas with colubrids, what you can get is overbreeding sometimes, so multiple clutching. Now, sometimes multiple clutching can occur naturally at the female's own desire. She can retain the sperm, and even if she's kept alone after mating, she can produce different clutches in the same year. That's fine, but you don't want that to be the norm. With the leopard geckos, again, that Joseph mentioned, see the thing, he mentioned the rock iguanas and the leopard geckos, and everyone will go on about, will happily accept the rock iguanas, but sort of pillory somebody who cohabits leopard geckos. I think the answer to that is that more people keep leopard geckos than keep rock iguanas. So to the average person keeping a leopard gecko on YouTube, I'm not going to be dismissive, but leopard geckos are beginner lizards that a lot of people that maybe are less initiated in herpetoculture would be keeping. So they've sort of been given these rules and they stick to it. And they see somebody who keeps a rock iguana, and they, by the very fact that they have a rock iguana, they regard this person as an expert. Whereas the fact that they keep leopard geckos entitles them to give an opinion. Mm-hmm. What we, of course, know is that leopard geckos are actually quite social and live in colonies in the wild. They have, communal latrines. You'll get colonies which will sort of fluctuate throughout the year with multiple females and a male, including younger animals. There is a certain amount of evidence that social behavior is attributed to leopard geckos as changing their behavioral repertoire. So despite the fact that people think that they're not social, leopard geckos are actually fairly social. It's just that if you've got it in a small enclosure, it's more likely to erupt in violence than if you've got it with the correct amount of room, as I would say. Again, with Liam's comment about the wild and whether or not we should be allowing our animals to breed, in a general sense, yes. I would suggest that if we are going to champion enrichment and allowing an animal to express its natural behaviors, breeding is one of the strongest drives these animals have. I would say the strongest after basking and eating. Especially after brumation, when the males come out, their breeding drive is insane, to the point that they will stop eating in many species for several months until they've bred. Now, in the wild, that's fine to an extent. In captivity, can we provide it? Yes. The other thing you've got to remember, though, is that even in social species, such as the Montpellier snakes that I mentioned, things can go wrong. You've got to remember that in captivity, aberrancies in normal behavior happen. So one thing that I got wrong, very wrong when I was young, is that I put a male and a female Montpellier snake together that I had caught when I was, 12 years old. And the male ate the female. It was considerably smaller. Now, these are snakes that I will give you loads of evidence that they are social. They display all kinds of amazing behaviors. And yet, despite their sociality, it ended up with the death of one of the snakes. So even with the most social species, things can go wrong. And again, this is another reason why, if you're not up to the risk, don't keep them together. There's nothing forcing anyone from cohabiting. And as I keep saying, there are probably more reasons not to do it than to do it. However, later on, I learned more about Montpellier snakes. I learned how to keep them, and I didn't have the same kind of accident. But accidents can happen. If you are going to mitigate risks, though, I mean, a lot of people will say they don't cohabit because it's too risky. There's a risk inherent in anything to do with animals. Something can go wrong. I've seen animals of other keepers die from being fed bad mice, frozen fed mice that poisoned them. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. I've seen animals die during brumation, again, with other keepers. Even in the wild, brumation is the riskiest time of the year for many snakes, and it is the time where most of them die. The highest mortality occurs during brumation. But on the flip side, with at least some snakes, brumation and being able to brumate extends their lifespan. So you've got kind of a double-edged sword here, whereas it's a risky time of year, but it also gets them to live longer. Do you risk it then by allowing them to brumate? I would say yes. Not everyone may agree, but I consider it a very natural part of their yearly cycle. So I would say the same with breeding. I think that about wraps it up. I mean, all I would say is that don't take anything in this video to mean that you have to cohabit, but also don't be scared to try cohabiting because there are things that can go wrong, because there's things that can go on in everything. An animal can burn itself on its own light bulb. I saw one example of a keeper that had a snake hang itself on a guard, of a bulb guard. There's risk in everything. I think that with animals that would encounter each other in the wild, as long as you're careful about your research, and as Laurie said, there is lots of research out there. I mean, this information doesn't just pop out of nowhere. It is there. And if you look into it and talk to other keepers, you will find people that have succeeded. Even with animals, I mean, so I say that there are problems with social snakes. So Montpellier snakes, I've had one eat the other. But I've also seen Ophiophagous snakes like king snakes. I know keepers that keep king snakes together that do fine. And now I personally would never keep a king snake because I know that they eat other snakes. But I know people that do, and they do well, and they've done it for years. Same with king rat snakes or stinking goddess, Elaphea carinata. Strong Ophiophagous snakes that you would expect would eat one another. But actually, I've seen several institutions, one in China and one in the Netherlands, that keeps them together, and they do just fine. Yeah. So the one thing to take away is there is no hard and fast rule, and that is why it's such a difficult topic, because there's always going to be an exception. There's always going to be somebody that succeeds and somebody that fails with every example. It's just a case of being observant, as Joseph said, making sure that you observe the animals, you know the behavior of the animals well inside out, and that the animals are healthy before you introduce them. And that will mitigate any problems that you can have, and then just be ready to separate should the need arise. That said, with all of the naysaying and caution, because, we're online, we have to give a bit of caution because we would hate somebody to follow our advice and then have an issue. Don't be scared of it, because lots of people cohabit and it works just fine. There are lots of things that can happen, but they rarely do. That's my experience, is that it's actually a lot easier than people give credit for, as long as you are following, the certain guidelines of size and space and visual barriers and choice for the animal. Yeah. I'm sorry for my long soliloquy throughout this.
I think that's a fantastic way to wrap up. And I mean, I think this is a record for podcast length, and it's because this conversation or this topic is so deep, and this concept, this practice is for the keeper who wants to do more research, wants to engage in the art of keeping on a deeper level. And if you're at that stage, this is an option that's available for you. If you're somebody that's just jumping in and you want to have 2 animals in the same house, don't do it. It's for a much more experienced, someone that's looking for a richer experience reptile keeping that already has a very, very solid foundation. So I think we covered a lot of ground today. I'm actually really looking forward to editing this one so I can go back through it, and I can't wait to release it. So thank you all for joining me on this 2.5-hour podcast. I know this is going to be a massive wealth of information, and it might, stir some pots around, which is also good as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for having me, and apologies for talking so much.
That's why you're here. Okay, that is the end of that episode. Francis, Lori, Joseph, and Liam, thank you so much for joining me. That was a great conversation. I think that's going to spark a lot of conversation as well. This is one of those topics that, like we said at the beginning, can be a little bit contentious. So I think it's good to spark some discussion. As the listeners, hopefully this made you think about cohabiting in a different way. If you were totally against it, maybe you're now a little bit more open to it. Maybe it's something you want to explore in the future once you have a little more experience under your belt. And again, don't treat this episode as an instruction manual for how to cohabit species. That really does come down to yourself. It comes down to the research that you've done on natural history, as well as your understanding of the animal's natural behaviors. So really that's all you, but hopefully this podcast has motivated you to explore this topic a little bit more. If you do think this was a valuable conversation and one that needs to be had within herpetoculture, make sure you share it on Instagram and Facebook. Tag us so we can come thank you. We would really appreciate that. And again, if you're looking for more information on this episode, as well as the photos that I talked about at the beginning, make sure you head to animalsathome.network.com, click on the Roundtable Discussions header, and there you will find this episode tile. Click on this episode, and there you'll find all the photos and links that are related to this specific episode. All right, everybody, thank you so much for listening. As always, I do really appreciate the support, and I will talk to you guys next week.